We're cooked. This is the last time I'm talking about this. The world is ending. Yet again. Those words were written after the predictable election of a fascist president, following a series of catastrophic failures of the left to come up with narratives that connect meaningfully with the struggles of the people. But those words weren't written in 2024, and they weren't even written about the USA. Those are the opening words of the 2018 essay, "They're Not Gonna Kill Us Now," by the Brazilian artist Jota Mombasa, expressing their shock after the election of another fascist president in another country, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And looking back at it now, in 2024, it's almost as if by opening their essay with those words, they were telegraphing to us in the future that it had happened before and that it was bound to happen again. And yet we learned nothing. Oh, by the way, hi, my name is Joris Lechen. I actually started this YouTube channel 4 years ago, but I quickly migrated to TikTok and then Instagram because my dopamine depleted brain found it easier to create short content for instant gratification. So most of you watching this video probably know me from there, and if you've never seen my face before, welcome. Apparently, I only make YouTube videos when Donald Trump is president. I typically try to avoid news-related content because if I start racing against the news cycle, the loser is going to be my mental health. But right now, it's for the sake of my mental health that I cannot not say anything. And the short video format didn't feel like the right place to process my thoughts and say what I'm about to say with the necessary nuance and depth. So I've sort of abandoned TikTok and Instagram, and here I am on the YouTuber. I am not going to spend the next hour and a half going through a list of all of the new ways in which the world is f***ed up that you hadn't thought about. That might work for a 2-minute TikTok video, but again, I am on this platform to do something different and also to spare my mental health. Plus, I'm going to assume that you're already aware that the world is f***ed up. You don't need convincing. In this video, I'm going to try to suggest some answers to the question we've all been asking ourselves: how do we survive a societal collapse? So heads up, this video will center the US, the core of empire. Which kind of goes against the principles of my decolonial work, if you're familiar with my content on the other platforms. But I'm gonna need you to bear with me and hear me out on this one. Because the entire point of this video is to discuss the methods and strategies we can use to collectively train ourselves to care less about the imperial, colonial, capitalist and white supremacist entity that is the United States of America. And how we can collectively protect ourselves in the US and outside and heal from the damage that empire and coloniality are inflicting upon humanity every single day. Knowing that for some of us, things are about to get real bad.
Chapter 1: The Appeal of Fascism.
But first, let's talk about how the hell we as a society we got here again. On the 5th of November 2024, I went to bed very late but quite calm. I was still confident that Kamala Harris would win, and by a landslide even, when I went to bed that night. Yeah. And then I woke up to several messages from several black friends in the US saying that they were making a move to get the head of the US ASAP. This is how I learned how misguided I had been. What do you say to your black and all queer friends in the United States, understandably panicked and distressed that Orange Man is getting back into power? Well, my first reaction was, yeah, get the f*** out. That country never wanted you, never deserved you anyway, so if you have the material means to do it, get out of the US, get out of the imperial core and join the revolution. If you know me, you know I'm not gonna stop you. But then the next question is, getting out of the US for where? The UK? Are you serious?
The British Empire was an amazing force for good, for civilization and for raising people's standards of living. So why should we have to pay for doing that? Surely we should be paid.
What part of the planet has not been affected by the soul corruption of coloniality? The brain rot of white supremacy, the violation of our humanity that is capitalism. All of these systems of oppression and alienation that the United States sits at the top of, but whose supremacy is maintained by the complicity of the ruling classes all around the world. Where is anybody safe from those systems? So to my friends in the US and to you watching this video wherever you're from, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I don't think the US, or the world for that matter, are as divided a society as you may think. The bad news is that the world is pretty united in support of fascism. This is why, even though I genuinely thought that Kamala Harris would win, the reasons why she didn't don't surprise me at all. This is after all an American tragedy, but a tragedy happening in the context of what I believe to be an ongoing global civilizational collapse. Let's be honest, we are not all exposed to the same risks and we aren't all suffering to the same degree from that collapse. But the global systems of oppression that we all need liberation from operate inside and outside of the United States. And so the victims of those systems also exist outside and inside of the United States. It is important that people from inside and outside of the US communicate with each other and organize a resistance movement that has a global approach.
We live in a world where the United States are ingrained in our politics, in our lifestyle, in everything we do in our economies. So it will be either subservience, a world made of vassals who abide by this lawlessness and nonsense that is being propagated. And the other will be to take a principled stance and say enough. So start disengaging.
Wherever the system is impacting you from, we all have a lot to learn from each other. And I know that I do not feel in my body the same sense of doom and dread as marginalized folks in the US or people in the global south may be feeling because of the outcome of the US elections. So, as a general disclaimer, none of what will be said in this video is meant to invalidate or override the choices, strategies and priorities of those of you who have much more skin in the game than I do. You know better than me what you need to do. This being said, whether you're American or not American, and if you have another spare, however long this video's runtime is going to be, follow this black, queer, Franco-British, Afro-Caribbean, neurodivergent, ADHD, ex-model, TikToker, decolonial sociology educator who's never actually been to the US. We're going to zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture so that we can figure out ways to escape from the grip of empire.
In order to understand, for example, U.S. police violence and its militarization, you can't understand that without understanding the U.S. in the Philippines, right? And the U.S. in Puerto Rico, and then the U.S. in Vietnam, right? And the U.S. in Korea. You're not going to understand white supremacy and violence here if you don't understand what's happening in Palestine.
Let's be clear. The victory of Trump is the result of a choice that was made repeatedly, consistently. It is a racist choice, a queerphobic choice, a transphobic choice. It is the choice of white supremacy, coloniality, patriarchy, capitalism and fascism. And white people and their adherents to white supremacy are responsible for the re-election of Donald Trump.
America is not who many leftists want to believe it is. The truth is that this country is deeply, deeply racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, fundamentally hateful, and downright uneducated. No one will gain anything from a Trump presidency, but the losses will be crippling.
Oh, by the way, you will see throughout this video some clips of people saying things that I think are important to illustrate the point that I make as a way of video citing them. But their opinions might still differ from the views that I am presenting in this video. End of disclaimer, on with the show. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that racism was not a major factor in this US election. If you know my content, you know that I'm being accused of being a raised grifter or gerfter, seeing racism everywhere and being a professional victim of racism on a daily basis. But the thing is, even if you remove the racism factor and the misogynoir factor, I am convinced that if instead of Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party had picked a white male candidate to run exactly the same campaign as Kamala Harris did, he still would have lost to Donald Trump. Because the 2024 elections follow a trajectory that is totally in line with global trends that are also verified in countries where anti-blackness isn't as much of a determining factor as it is in the United States. I was back on my home island of Guadeloupe, a black Caribbean overseas territory of France, during the last French presidential elections in 2022. And in my very black, very fierce, very proud Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, the candidate of the National Rally, the far-right French Nationalist Party, whose platform had historically been the most closely and openly aligned with the colonial project and with white supremacy, received a landslide majority of 69% of the votes. What? In Guadeloupe. During the whole campaign, I had to watch close friends, family members, quietly embrace or openly spout the white supremacist, fascist discourse of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. That's when I knew that the global rise of fascism could not be explained by the simple and somewhat comforting idea for a black progressive like me that it was solely due to white people wanting to maintain white supremacy. And before 2022, I'd already had a glimpse of that hard-to-swallow pill in Brazil, as I happened to be there during the inauguration of fascist President Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. Is it me? Am I the problem? And there too, I already had to make peace with the fact that a huge part of his electorate were disenfranchised, working-class, impoverished people of color. The very people who make up the coalition that, in theory, my leftist ideals tell me should be leading the revolution. There's a reason why I opened this video with a quote from a Brazilian activist grappling with this very difficult realization. Because yes, the presence of racism absolutely creates fertile ground for fascism. But where this correlation becomes very uncomfortable is that in highly racist societies, adherence to fascistic ideologies is rising among both the group doing the racism and among the victims of that racism.
I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
Because anywhere in the world, the choice of fascism is a reaction to society falling apart. And across the board, regardless of social classes and races, societal collapse plus hope equals revolution. But societal collapse plus fear equals fascism. And I believe that to be especially true of all disenfranchised demographics placed under socio-economic stress.
I think a lot of people did not want to vote for a black woman. I think a lot of this is revenge, cultural revenge. I've been saying this is the revenge vote, but think also about the ways that being economically disenfranchised make you more susceptible to extremist rhetoric. We see that in the United States. We see that across the world.
I do recognize, though, that the internalization and adherence to coloniality in the US is stronger than elsewhere, because it is literally the core of empire, and those who are trying to fight it are facing a uniquely powerful enemy. This is why I don't think I'll ever get to see in my lifetime something like this happening in the US Congress.
Ex-New Zealand.
11 votes in favour.
New Zealand first.
8 votes in favour.
Te Pāti Māori.
E ono ngā poti.
If 6 votes opposed.
This gives me goosebumps and brings tears to my eyes every time I watch it. But even though I concede that the colonial project, racism and white supremacy are uniquely powerful in the US, I am still convinced that in a context of abundance, prosperity and collective integration, racism would go down. Oppression would go down, because the structures of power and exploitation that racism was invented to serve and maintain would cease to be relevant. So looking at racism and racism only kind of misses the forest for the tree. And that's on purpose, because everywhere in the world under coloniality, the isolation and compartmentalization of the struggles is a tool of oppression. Elon Musk said that DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion, must die. And I agree with him, but for slightly different reasons. I am a DEI trainer and consultant. That's what I do for a living. And I'm telling you that DEI is bullshit. Because DEI is a corporate invention that sells you neatly packaged quick and easy solutions to fix racism if that's the package you're going for, to tackle sexism if that's the workshop you're buying, to increase LGBTQIA plus visibility for Pride Month, to increase disability awareness for your one employee in the wheelchair. But God forbid anyone actually looks at the systemic and structural root causes of those discriminations and holds any organizations accountable for long-term durable change. That's not what DEI is here for. And that's not by mistake, it's by design. Because my colleagues and I, Dr. Kula and Dr. Jackson Cole, quickly realized that DEI was actually being used by British universities, our main pool of clients, to give the impression of doing something without actually doing anything, we decided that adopting the framework of decoloniality to inform our approach to DEI trainings was the best way to address the root of those issues holistically. We believe that deprioritizing structures of power and dominance and focusing instead on connectedness and integration is a template that works for anti-racism education, for LGBTQIA plus advocacy, for disability integration, for gender inequality, etc., etc. But guess what? Nobody wants it. We're out of a job. It's not trendy enough. In hindsight, it's not that surprising coming from institutions who have been, for the past year, so dedicated to violently repressing students for expressing their views against the genocide of Palestinians, and for demanding divestments from arms manufacturers and banks who actively participated in the genocide. This is where you see that capitalism and coloniality, and in this video I am using those terms interchangeably because they are two faces of the same coin, are so good at giving the impression of giving a but in reality, by ring-fencing, compartmentalizing, splitting the systemic issues into sound bites, they ensure that nothing changes. DEI is the blue bracelets of corporations. It's the academia version of the Instagram black square for BLM.
I think one of the things that will take us further into overt fascism is our inability to find common ground and advocate for one another and see common ground in our struggles.
So the reason why I gave you all of this backstory about DEI, well, aside from the fact that it's my video and I do what I want, is that I really think that only analyzing Trump's re-election and Kamala Harris's colossal defeats through the lens of racism and sexism is backing ourselves into a corner that isn't going to give us any clarity or solutions to get ourselves out of. Now more than ever, I see how decoloniality can explain and challenge the dynamics happening now. More than ever, I feel vindicated, and more than ever, I realize the potential power that decoloniality has and why it's being snubbed by agents of the status quo.
I was really surprised when I found out that my teaching assistant was a Trump supporter because we'd worked together for many years and I assumed that we had the same values, and like she has a kid who's queer, she has a kid who's disabled, she's always advocated for marginalized communities, and so I was really surprised when she said that she supported Trump. And so I asked her about it and she just said that she believes that Trump is going to be the person who best advocates for the LGBT community, that Trump is going to be the best supporter of marginalized communities. And I just realized that, yeah, we do share the same values. We just don't share the same reality.
When I realized that my home country, my people, the people that I loved had voted for the fascist candidate in the French elections, I had two options. Either cut off my people, my country, an entire community and culture upon which I had slowly built my sense of identity for the past decade or two, reject them and write them off as dumb and hateful, or I had to understand and still love them so I could continue to love myself through them too. I had to walk through the process backward and start from the assumption that given the circumstances that my people were in, somehow their choices must have made sense. That didn't mean that I agreed with that choice, but if I wanted to engage meaningfully with it, I had to look at it with compassion to understand it, so that I could eventually counter it and make sure it doesn't keep happening. So yes, now back to the election of Orange Man. A Trump vote is a racist vote, and I don't like racism very much. But the success of both Trump and racism are the products of a system that is being reinforced every time people feel pushed into a false binary choice. What if binary choices were inherently oppressive and that was the explanation to the issue from the beginning? Trying to play the blame game of what demographic didn't support Kamala Harris enough in the US elections risks missing a very important point. A binary system can only produce abnormal, illogical results. Capitalism is entirely built on coercion. For instance, you are coerced into giving away the product of your labor. Technically, you could refuse to do so, but then you would inevitably enjoy the freedom of not being alive. You are coerced into paying rent. You could choose not to, but then you would enjoy the freedom of being homeless. So those aren't real choices that are offered to us. Our current system not only oppresses us, but forces us to pick which way we're going to be oppressed with the illusion of having a choice. When the only two binary options available to you are surviving or dying, that's not really a choice, is it? Now imagine that in this equation, instead of it's either survival or death, one of the parties involved tells you it's either your survival or, if you choose us, the system dies. Suddenly one of the choices promises you an outlet to express your frustration, your anger. Suddenly it becomes tempting to go, "F it, let's try." And that is a form of accelerationism. Now put a pin on this, we'll get back to this concept later. But yes, of course, accelerationism is a flawed logic. But as much as we disagree with that choice, people choosing the path that they perceive will speed up the process of destruction of a system that they fundamentally reject is an outcome that we should expect, that we have to prepare for, and that will keep repeating itself until we finally break the system that produces that outcome. Another outcome that is completely counterproductive but that is to be expected in a context of social stress is people concluding that in the absence of justice, the next best thing is punishment.
Black folks, take your asses back to Starbucks. Go get your mocha frappuccinos. Cause I'm about to go get me a whole 24 fucking case. I sure am. I just saw a video of a Palestinian woman saying, vote for Jill Stein or Donald Trump, but whatever you do, don't vote for Kamala Harris because you will not be accepted into my community. Fine, bitch. We're going to go ahead and give money to that community.
Now, I know you're probably sick of the controversy around this video, but trust that I wouldn't be bringing it up if I didn't feel I had something to add to this conversation. I've seen many of the people who share my political views responding to this person that she was stupid because going back to Starbucks wasn't going to advance her cause. But I don't think those people paid attention to what she was actually saying because she knows that. She says it in the video.
When I get to this point at Sagittarius, baby, I'm burning everybody, okay? Myself included. The bridge, the house, the people, the animals, and the motherfucking trees. Everybody can get it. Myself included. Myself included.
But the thing is, as tempting as it is to dunk on that person, if you pause to understand her logic, you will understand the logic of many people who voted for Trump as well. And once you understand that, you can begin to actually do something about it. Because the true irony in the rationale of that person going back to Starbucks out of spite is that by seeking to punish someone, anyone, for the defeat of Kamala Harris, she's actually perpetrating exactly the same logic as the people who voted for Trump. And that logic is, if I cannot punish the system that is oppressing me, I've got to punish somebody, anybody, because that's the closest to having agency the system will ever allow me to feel. So I exercise the little power I have by punishing somebody who's got nothing to do with it in a way that's not going to advance my cause in the slightest, but for a fleeting moment, it makes me feel good because that's all I have.
Black folks, fuck that shit. Go get your frappuccinos. Go back to McDonald's. Stop protesting everybody that we was protesting, because we already know what the fuck they did. They fucked us because they were already fucked and didn't know that fucking us fucked them even more, because we ain't for y'all asses no more. Suffer. I actually feel good about that.
It's a case of a victim of bullying dealing with their shame of being a victim by becoming a bully themselves. Once again, is it misguided? Obviously. But is it surprising? Absolutely not. It's the logical outcome of an oppressive premise. Now we can spend our time humiliating, demonizing, screaming at the people who fell for that trick, because it is a trick, it's a lie, but it's only going to entrench them further into their choice. Or we can try to understand that faced with the cruelty of the irrational binary choice that they had to make, there is a glint of rationality in their decision that they keep making. Because the choice to vote for fascism is kind of logical if you look at it in a certain way, actually. There cannot be a right answer when the question is wrong. There cannot be a right choice between two absurd options. So yes, a choice for fascism is wrong, it's mistaken, it's dangerous, but in a context that capitalizes on your fear and induced insanity by design, it's a choice that makes sense. And expecting a different outcome from the same binary choice presented to people at every election, that's what's irrational here. If we keep approaching this vote from the perspective of those people are dumb, those people are irrational, we will not break the cycle. Obviously, the question of how fascism is so successful at presenting itself as revolutionary when its entire reason of existing is to serve power, and why leftist discourses are utterly incapable of reclaiming the language, the theory and the praxis of revolution, that's a question I ask myself every day. How the right successfully appropriated the counterculture narrative that originated from leftism, that will be a conversation for another time. But don't blame each other, blame the system. Don't fight each other, fight the system. Don't abandon hope, abandon the ideology that Western politics are going to save us, because they're not. I believe that if we are progressive, if we want a better society, we need to understand why the people who in theory we should be in coalition with choose to side with the oppressor and not with us. Now, whose duty is it to produce the emotional labor to speak with those who made the choice of fascism? Maybe not me, and maybe not you. Historically, marginalized groups have borne the burden of healing the people who were complicit in their oppression, and that's certainly not what I'm advocating for here. It's certainly not black women's job to coddle Trump voters into seeing them as human, but that's gonna have to be somebody's job at some point.
Hey white folks, do you mind if we have a quick chat? What we have to recognize is that we all have relative privilege over one another, so we have to use the power that we have been afforded by these systems of oppression to help tear these systems of oppression down. You can do it. You're white. So why aren't white people doing the one thing that we need them to do in order to be free of white supremacy? If I'm able to be more patient with white people than white people are able to be with one another, I'm a little hopeless. But I think maybe we all just needed a pep talk.
We need a grand narrative that recenters human connections, a unifying project that appeals to all of the oppressed, including those who were previously siding with the oppressor. We need to help each other uninstall the internalized oppression we have been absorbing all our lives. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, the patriarchy, they all are interconnected symptoms of fear, scarcity mindset, disenfranchisement, and despair. If you're not familiar with my content, you may be wondering why I seem to be focusing so much on African Americans in this conversation. There is an understandable trauma felt by black people for always being taken for granted by the Democratic Party during the campaigns and then being blamed for the defeat when the Democrats lose. So let me clarify that that's not what I'm doing here. The reason why I mostly talk about black people here is because I prioritize talking to the people I am in community of interest with. I am black and I center the marginalized experience in my work and in my discourse, so that's why the lens of blackness is the one that I'm choosing for most of this video. But now that this is out of the way, I confess that it's been rather uncomfortable to watch some so-called leftist Americans and marginalized Americans claim to want a change while professing their allegiance to the United States of America and what it supposedly stands for. It's a white European settler colony. It continues to be somewhat disappointing to me to see African American advocates show very little curiosity for other black liberation struggles outside of the US. How do you expect to imagine a different society for yourself if you're not in communication and community of interest with the people who already exist outside of the society you're trying to change and who have the lived experience of an alternate future for yourself? Don't even get me started on those clowns. They do not want society to change. The system gave them a seat at the table of the oppressor, but they don't even realize that they are licking food straight off the table. If there was ever any doubt that black capitalism was still a vassal of white fascism, well, here's your proof.
In her book Killing Rage, Bell Hooks states that black consciousness cannot be radicalized as long as the black bourgeoisie maintains its radical hold on the black imagination. And I wholeheartedly believe in this, and I encourage every single one of us to look within and ask ourselves, what do we imagine when we think of liberation? Do we imagine individual wealth beyond imagination, or do we imagine communal liberation? If your liberation is wearing a Gucci suit and driving a Maserati, your imagination is incorrect. Sorry, if your imagination is smoking weed at the beach with your homies smiling at each other because the empire has fallen and everyone has free healthcare, your imagination is correct. Yes, today I'm giving people Fs for improper imagination.
I understand having emotional attachment to the only environment we've ever known. Better the devil you know, I guess. It's a normal thing to have emotional attachment to our community, to the society that we grew up in and that shapes who we are. That's necessary for our own sense of identity and belonging. And I would never take that away from anybody because that would be inhumane. But when that environment is the most aggressive global hegemonic superpower, the implications are not the same. Pledging to maintain or not prioritizing the dismantlement of that hegemony isn't going to liberate anybody. It is obvious that the strategies and priorities for liberation cannot be the same when you're outside or when you're inside of the core of empire. A Trump presidency and fascism in general will further reduce the ability for people to organize, to advocate, to form unions, to leverage their collective power as citizens, as customers, as voters. More and more people will lose access to material commodities, to leisure, to comfort, to rest, to the ability to choose. People are and will be losing agency. But there's one realm that Trump cannot take away from anybody. It's imagination. In the midst of a social collapse, we need to urgently relocate our emotional commitments. We need to rewrite our attachments away from the values and structures that were never designed to serve us. We need to refurbish our sense of identity and belonging and reshape the material, cultural and emotional bonds that we have with this society. We need to divest from empire.
We need to divest.
So what do I mean by divesting from empire? Well, that's the title of this whole video, so as you can imagine, I have a thing or two to say about the topic. But divesting can mean different things for different movements. So before we delve into what I have in mind when I call for us to divest from the multiple intertwined systems of oppression that the United States are the epitome of, and that I'm calling here empire, let's have a look at other divestment movements. In early December last year, there was controversy brewing around the fact that Beyoncé's movie Renaissance was going to be showcased in Tel Aviv, as Israel was already 2 months into this stage of its genocidal project against Palestinians in Gaza. Some people, myself included, expressed disappointment that she didn't cancel the shows in Israel, to which somebody, an Israeli Zionist in my DMs, replied to me as a gotcha moment, "BDS much?" And I must have stared at the comment for a few seconds. You see, I knew that BDS stood for Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, and that it was a Palestinian-led effort started in 2005 to challenge in a grassroots and non-violent way the Israeli settler colonial project. What I was rather confused about is that 2 months into a live broadcast genocide, this Israeli Zionist in my DM still thought that the rest of the world was still at the stage where accusing me of promoting BDS was going to be like a social condemnation that I would beg him to strike off my records. Oh no, please, I swear I wasn't calling for BDS. BDS much? What do you mean? Of course BDS. Dude, at this point BDS revendication had already become almost obsolete. We were long past the point of calling for an end to the Israeli settlement in the West Bank. Against a backdrop of the methodical extermination of Palestinians in Gaza, we were calling for Palestinian liberation, their right to self-determination, and an end to the Israeli apartheid regime in its current late-stage genocidal form. That ship had already sailed and somehow managed to sink in the Dead Sea a long time ago. So, what's the takeaway from this very tangential story? By calling for divestment from the United States, from white supremacy, from capitalism, from coloniality, from empire in general with a capital E, I am fully aware that this is only meant to be the beginning. I know that as soon as the structures of the system we all live in begin to really shake, then the question of divestment from that system will very quickly become obsolete. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that it isn't a necessary step to be taken in the present moment by whoever has the material conditions that would allow them to divest from empire. Divestment is supposed to be whatever temporary measure can shield us from the reach of empire and buy ourselves time to organize and create without losing our soul. And make no mistake, like this dude accusing me of BDS, any push for divestment is very correctly identified as a threat by the people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. And this is how we know it works. Immediately after Orange Man's re-election was announced, people wanted to do something in protest, but also as an act of protection. So some American women looked at the 4B movement that started in South Korea and decided that this would be their act of divestment. Divesting from men. The 4B movement got its name from the word no in Korean, which begins with the sound B. So the 4 no's of the 4B movement are no dating men, no sex with men, no marriage with men, and not giving birth. Considering that men, and more specifically white men, are the demographic that voted the most for Donald Trump, it makes sense that there should be some consequences felt for their selfish choices. The efficacy of it this time? That's not for me to decide. Although I do wonder what would happen if gay black men rose up and started a sex strike. Never gonna happen. But the fact that there is a long list in recent history of women, particularly women from the global majority, going on sex strikes in Kenya, in Liberia, South Sudan, Togo, Colombia, the Philippines, shows that decentering men and their desires must be working. Since it's a common tactic in the arsenal of anti-oppression movements, it deserves its entry on my list of acts of material divestment from empire. Further down, way further down my material divestment tier list, there is the Blockout campaign. Remember?
Tons of people are blocking Taylor Swift, Beyoncé, and other massive celebrities across social media as part of the Blockout movement in response to celebrities' views, or lack thereof, on Palestine.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about it too. But as easy as it may be to dunk on performative TikTok trends...
But no worries, celebrities found a way around. They're buying...
I think that the Blockout campaign was a sign that people had correctly identified that this system was promoting the wrong values, rewarding the wrong behaviors, and praising the wrong people for it. We need to pick up our marbles and choose to invest our time, our attention, and our emotions somewhere else, for our own sanity's sake. And in my opinion, the Blackout campaign is a clumsy answer to the correct analysis. There's no real choice under coercion, there's no freedom in survival, and of course there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. So the options for divesting our consumption, i.e. divesting our money, but also our attention and our time away from the systems while we still have to exist in them, are rather limited. They do exist though. Again, material divestment is far from the last stop before Revolution Central, but the boycott of Starbucks, for instance, is still going strong. Big media publications such as The Guardian and millions of users are finally leaving Twitter. And there are growing calls to stop this madness of getting a new phone every year.
It's going to affect all of us. Just save your money. And if that means you don't buy Christmas presents for people who did vote for Trump because that's how we got into this mess, so be it.
And I'll take it even further. What if we just didn't buy Christmas presents at all? No Black Friday, no Boxing Day. What if we pledged to gift immaterial presents to the people we love? What if we decided to see getting together and spending time in community as a reciprocal gift to that community? What if we all went to Scotland to ethically support McDonald's? In Scotland, you can eat at McDonald's without compromising on your values or your diet. Sort of. None of those are society-changing events, but they make the idea of change more palpable and more appealing to millions of people. Yes, it's only one small step, but they're stepping into the light. Divesting from capitalism and decoloniality means no longer hyper-consuming, no longer engaging in well-being and mindfulness crap that starts from the assumption that individualism is where it begins and where it ends.
There's been a lot of talk about buy nothing, and I don't actually want to live in a world where we buy nothing. I want to live in a world where you take some time off and come back and decide what's the best ethical spend for your money.
But materially divesting from capitalism, coloniality, patriarchy, white supremacy, and hyper-individualism, as they are currently represented in their most extreme version by the US hegemony, and also by Western monoculture in general, does not mean divesting from American people. It means embracing and supporting those who suffer from those systems, including American citizens, while challenging and opposing those who work to uphold those systems. And all of that with the knowledge that very often, they're the same people. Yeah, if you've come this far into the video and you hadn't realized yet that divesting from empire would mostly require love and compassion, go back to the top. Also, it would be quite rich of me to call for the rejection of American people in general, as if I wasn't also on the comfortable end of the North-South divide and Western hegemony. By the same token as American people must learn to decenter America to heal from its oppression, I too need to decenter my European experience, the Western side of my identity, and my internalized whiteness to heal from those systems, and to also then help others heal too. So materially divesting from empire needs to happen at the periphery, but from within the core of empire too. And if you leave at the core of it, the most radical way to materially divest from empire, when you realize that you're the material that fuels the system, is to physically remove yourself from empire, i.e., get the fuck out. Now, anyone who's ever been in an abusive relationship, or anyone who has the bare minimum of emotional intelligence to feel sympathy for victims of abuse, will know that it's not easy to get out of an abusive situation. In the workshops that I deliver, whenever me and my colleagues get to the section about how to deal with microaggressions, I always insist that the situation we should prepare ourselves the most for, they're never the clear-cut instances of overt racism or sexism, the kind that you see in the movies where a hero stands up and yells, "This is unacceptable!" No. What we need to prepare ourselves for are the situations that are kind of in a grey area, where we're like, what did you just say? That's not really appropriate, is it? What? Is it? You know, you feel that something's not quite right, but you're not sure if any line has been crossed because you feel that there might be some context you're missing. Maybe the presumed victim is in on the joke. Maybe they don't think it's a big deal, so who am I to make a fuss on their behalf if they say it's fine? So you end up doing nothing. Not because you don't care, but because you're not sure if a boundary has been crossed or not. So you freeze. So to come back to the topic at hand, when do you know that the situation at home is hopeless? That a boundary has been crossed? That it's time for you to leave? That no matter what you do, things won't get better, so you need to go even if that's all you've ever known? How do you know that? In his book, The Wretched of the Earth, my fellow French Antillean Frantz Fanon writes that
the native is always on the alert, for since he can only make out with difficulty the many symbols of the colonial world, he is never sure whether or not he has crossed a frontier.
The oppressor always keeps the oppressed in the dark about his own boundaries, so that the oppressed never learns to set their own boundaries. So how do you know? What is your cue to tap out?
As some of you may know, my family fled the Duvalier regime, the dictatorship in Haiti in the 80s, and eventually made our way to the US. And I have been thinking this morning about how my parents knew when it was time to go. Like, what signs are you looking for to determine that the rhetoric has turned into action before it's too late? And I don't have an answer to that. Hindsight is 20/20. However, it's something that I think myself and probably a lot of other people who carry the trauma of displacement think about a lot. It's when will we have to go? When will we have to leave again? And will we be ready?
It will never be my place to judge people who choose to leave in order to resist, or judge people who choose to stay in order to resist. There isn't a choice that is a purer form of divestment than the other. See my friend Liz Booker, one of the friends who had initially messaged me the morning after the elections that she was moving out of the US. She has since decided to not, actually. Her knowledge and her skills were more needed for the resistance in the US than anywhere else. So for now, she's staying there. Meanwhile, T, aka Nappy-Headed Jojoba, a YouTuber that I've been following for quite a few years, has been planning her own exit since 2020, documenting and creating resources and connecting those who have directly taken the leap with those who are still thinking about it under the name of Project Exodus. The thing though, is that Project Exodus is specifically for Black people. Because we know that Black people, racialized people, visibly queer people are going to be the first victims of 4 more years of Trump. But we also know that they're the least likely to have the material conditions to leave the United States and start a new life elsewhere, even though they're the ones who deserve it the most. We know that those who can easily shelter themselves from the most oppressive aspects of empire tend to be those who benefit from it the most, and those who bear the biggest responsibility for the current state of society. But they're also the ones with the means to leave. So, what's going to happen?
Because I've noticed an uptick in emboldened behavior from white people who consider themselves allies or good white people. The blue braceleters, the not all white peoplers, and the progressive whites. And it's so insidious. It's a slightly ruder tone, making slightly more slip-ups using words, taking up slightly more space, slightly more sloppiness with assumptions, exercising slightly more privilege. All of it ever so incremental, yet so obsequiously part of the same white supremacist system that got Trump elected. It's almost as if self-declared white allies, while worrying about fascism in the US empire, are still able to breathe a sigh of relief that the system that keeps whiteness possible is at least still going to keep part of their identity intact. Fascism in the US, after all, means that white privilege will still be protected. It's almost as if a heavily protected guardrail has come down to once again give rise to the, at least I'm not one of those white people, privilege.
But even if you're not ultra-privileged, even if you've been historically oppressed by the United States of America in the US, there are still many ways in which you could, unknowingly, redeem your American Empire Club card points as soon as you set foot abroad. Even if you were never allowed to use that card at home, you're still carrying it with you everywhere you go.
To be clear, this isn't explicitly a white thing. I know that in some ways as an American citizen, I'm complicit in what America does around the world, regardless of the fact that I am black.
And don't worry, I'm certainly not immune from making mistakes either. Because as an Afro-Caribbean and European black person, I have to do the work to decenter my westernized version of blackness too when I'm in the global south. So if it's materially possible for you to remove yourself from the core of empire by migrating to another country, great. As you become a guest on someone else's land though, ask yourself, are you fleeing the core of empire as a maroon or as a settler colonizer? One of my favorite quotes from George Bernard Shaw, and incidentally the only one I know from him, is,
"Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and besides, the pig likes it."
And I find the pig analogy fitting in more than one way here. While some methods of frontal resistance seek to wrestle with empire as our proverbial pig, which is absolutely necessary when the pig we're facing is charging in our direction, I think that divesting is also a valid form of resistance, but one that precisely tries to never wrestle with the pigs. By saying that, though, I'm fully aware that I'm speaking from a place of privilege.
What they're doing right now is they're trying to present someone like me, a black transgender woman, as a scapegoat. They have to believe that if someone like me is finally subjugated, they will be able to get right back into the position that they should be. America will be great again, and the white man will be powerful. But of course, it's all a fucking scam.
I know that this big picture approach is only possible when your body is not directly on the line. I do think it's important to look at the big picture, but I also know that not everyone has that luxury available to them right now. And I want to make it clear that what I say must not override the choices and priorities of those who are in much greater danger than I am. If you're a Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, Sudanese, Congolese, trans person of color, black woman trying to get an abortion in a US southern state, when the pigs attack you, you wrestle back. If your current lived experience of oppression and colonization is not a metaphor, then your priority is to fight back whichever way you can. And I am not here to stop you. And if your survival or integrity depends on it, chances are you were already fighting anyway. So just ignore me, or still drop a follow and comment for engagement. It's always appreciated. Even though the main thesis of this video essay is to explore the ways we can disengage from empire, I hope it is understood as a part of a broader context of resistance and opposition to empire. And in a resistance movement, we can't all play the same role. And while some of us may need to divest, that endeavor should never get in the way of the people who have the skills and the capacity and the material conditions to organize resistance, educate, and choose to fight rather than divesting. We need those too.
It can seem contradictory to work within and engage with a system that's systematically harming our people. And as a black woman in the United States, I fully understand that. But I'm also from a majority black city in the southern United States that's at the heart of the civil rights movement known as Memphis, Tennessee. And if there's one thing I learned growing up there, it's that we need people within our own community to consistently engage with the system as a form of protection, but also to get progress. The Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott is an excellent example of this. The story of this is often whitewashed to undermine the hard work that Black Americans put into this, because they act like Rosa Parks just sat down on the bus one day because her feet were tired, and then a whole civil rights movement was born, and that's not how it happened. This was over 12 years in the making, with attorneys like Thurgood Marshall, who was an attorney for the NAACP at the time, and then later became the first Black Supreme Court justice, working within the legal system to change the unjust laws. We had civil rights leaders encouraging the community to vote for John F. Kennedy because they knew that he would be better for the progress of Black Americans. And so for those who have the capacity within our community to engage, they should.
So when I talk about divestment as resistance, this is not instead of frontal resistance, but as a complement to other forms of resistance. This isn't about decorum. This isn't about respectability politics. This is no when they go low, we go high type of shit. This is about protecting ourselves, our humanity, our mental health, our communities. It's about making sure that our agency is not relegated to merely reacting to the oppressor, making sure that the fight is sustainable and not letting the oppressor set the terms of our fight and choose the battlefield. Frontal resistance is reactive, divestment resistance is proactive.
To my whole documentary on why you should vote in the election and stuff, 85,000 views. My video about the loss and the tragedy and feelings and all we feeling, like now that it has happened, more than 500,000 views. You see what I'm saying? It's like, this is this trend of like, I feel like people never want to listen or get involved when we can actually do something preventative. Like everybody always wants to react, respond, you know what I mean?
So frontal resistance fighters are usually more focused on reacting, and that's fine. But also they have the inconvenient habit of getting killed. Which brings me to my next tangent, in which I propose that perhaps in liberation movements, it's about time that we figured out an alternative to the myth of the martyr. Toussaint Louverture, Louis Delgrès, Zumbi dos Palmares, Walter Rodney, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, in no particular order, died directly or indirectly as a consequence of their frontal resistance to the oppression. They sacrificed themselves for freedom, and for their martyr, they are heroes. But they're the ones who died. In the grand scheme of things, some will argue that their martyrdom got us closer to achieving their goal, because their name and their sacrifice now resonates throughout history for generations to come. But some might view their death as a net loss for their cause, because they didn't get to finish the job. And we will never know what Fred Hampton would have gone on to achieve if it stayed alive. Obviously, that's not their fault if they got killed. But frontal resistance, the type of activism they engaged in, albeit necessary, has it built into its fabric that death is a possible outcome. And while we rightly praise the sacrifice of those heroes, I think that we might be overlooking another type of resistance, one that doesn't prioritize confrontation with the oppressor, one that is equally as important as frontal resistance, a type of resistance that has been here all along, inspirational resistance. In the face of oppression, inspirational resistance focuses on community building, knowledge and culture production, joy finding, creativity, storytelling, connectedness, meaning making, imagination.
Imagination. Crazy nation.
Both frontal resistance and inspirational resistance are two necessary sides of the same coin, in my opinion. But because we in the West live in a culturally Christian-leaning society, with the sacrifice of Jesus Christ as our ultimate act of heroic activism, I think that we tend to favor so much the stories of lone male heroes who died for our collective salvation that we neglect the achievements of those who survived. How else would you explain that the figure and the work of Kwame Ture is not as widely studied, praised and followed as the work and figure of Malcolm X? If not for the fact that Kwame Ture made the rather selfish choice of not getting assassinated. To be again absolutely clear, this is not an indictment on those who died for the cause or frontal resistance altogether. This is a reflection on where our attention goes and what we overlook when we have a selective understanding of what liberation struggles look like. While we study the life and death of MLK, maybe we would do well in also studying how James Baldwin was fighting with his pen, how Aimé Césaire lived to 94 years old of age, and how Angela Davis is still alive and what she's been up to. While we praise the martyrs of frontal resistant fighters, maybe there's something to learn about the fact that Harriet Tubman, Claudia Jones, Nina Simone, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, all engaged in their own way in what I'd call inspirational resistance, and all died of natural causes after a lifetime of achievements. And I don't think that it's by coincidence that many of the leaders of the inspirational type of resistance happen to be women. I know. The idea that an entire field of work that is structurally undervalued, taken for granted and rendered almost invisible might be in majority occupied by women is absolutely unheard of. Shocking.
Oh my God, I cannot believe it.
And that's a shame, because in this current climate, I do think that we would benefit from learning how to survive as much as learning how to fight, if not more. And okay, yeah, that neat distinction between frontal activism and inspirational activism has its limitations. For instance, in which of those two neat categories would you put the queer liberation icons Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera? Those are two figures of a liberation movement that wouldn't fit the binary. Quite literally. But in all of the resistance and liberation movements that I'm kind of, sort of, part of, or adjacent to, namely decoloniality, the BLM movement, the neurodiversity movement, LGBTQIA+ movements, and Palestine liberation movements, I keep seeing similar profiles of people who are joining the movement and move through those spaces exclusively with the intention of being frontal resistant fighter heroes, and who either neglect and sometimes full-on antagonize those in the same movement who engage in inspirational resistance. And I think that's dangerous, because in addition to disrupting community building and collective organization, by antagonizing people who are working towards the same goal, those individual lone heroes become massive liabilities for the movement they claim to support. By centering themselves in their martyr mentality, retaliation from the oppressor ceases to be just a possible outcome of their struggle. It becomes their end goal. Becoming the victim of the system in the most visible and spectacular way is the only feature of their activism. And by doing so, not only do they put other more vulnerable, less privileged and less visible members of the movement in danger, but also they force the movements to divest part of their time and precious resources into defending and protecting their self-centered endeavor. There is merit in fighting the oppression head-on. But when possible, there is also merit in snubbing the oppression, in having the audacity to organize our community, ignoring the oppressor, not recognizing its power, even its presence.
The Nazis see revolution as inherently violent, and now they have control of the state's ability to do violence. So honestly, they are hoping that you are violent because then they can react with more violence. They control the police now. They control the government. The revolution is not you picking up a handgun and then being lost to senseless gun violence. The revolution is you meeting up with another progressive in real life and teaming up.
We can't just escape the oppression materially or physically, but there's one realm that we still have dominion over, the realm of our affect, of our emotions.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear. If I could have that half of my life, no fear.
At this point of the video, hearing the title Emotional Divestment, you might be slightly worried that I'm about to imply that if you're oppressed by empire, as long as you don't think about it and switch off your emotions, you'll be fine. Like,
oh, you have depression? Have you tried thinking positively?
It's about mastering your thoughts, beliefs, and habits. It's about cultivating a winning mindset.
Don't worry, we don't do that here. Once again, divestment, especially emotional divestment, shouldn't be pursued instead of other forms of resistance, but as one of the multiple forms of resistance we should be using simultaneously. Divestment is a form of protection. It's a strategic use of our emotions as a finite resource that we need to be allocated intentionally and wisely, so it can heal and grow. In their forthcoming paper on the coloniality of connectedness, decolonial scholars Jackson Cole, Le Chêne and Kula, yeah, Le Chêne, that's me, I'm citing myself, whatever, argue that one of the essential aspects of coloniality is the severing of the connections that exist naturally between people, their environments, their community, and their sense of self. Whether we like it or not, our emotions are a key battleground for coloniality and empire. So in order to counter the dehumanizing effects of empire, as we begin to reconnect with the parts of us that the systems of exploitation and extraction had alienated us from, we must disconnect from empire. We must learn to stop caring about its stories, its rules, its norms and prescriptions. And when I say stop caring, I really mean it. I see some of my favorite TV shows, for instance, or YouTube channels reverting back to what they were doing during the first Trump presidency, which is talking non-stop about Trump and Republicans and their supporters.
What do you think about foreign aid to Israel? Is it a strategic partnership? Israel is a part.
I don't care.
The chainsaw for bureaucracy. Elon Musk wielding a chainsaw in Washington.
I don't care.
So Trump just said inflation's back. What do you mean it's back? So it went away?
I don't care.
2 stranded NASA astronauts. The online spat came in response to a remark Elon Musk made during an interview with Fox News earlier.
I don't care.
Jesse Waters is now pushing back against Donald Trump after Musk's doggy organization led to a friend of his.
What are we doing? Guys, this is not resistance. This is capitulation. Even if you talk about Trump and Republicans in a negative way, you're still centering them. Don't get me wrong. Mocking the ruling class, punching up at power is cathartic.
Trump has ushered in the purge!
It makes the powerless bond over a common enemy. I engage in it myself every now and then. It's perfectly fine in small doses. But when that's all you've got to offer 24/7, you're not liberating anyone. You are complicit in upholding the paradigm of the oppressor. Those people not only are choosing to wrestle with the pigs, they have permanently set up camp in the pigsty. And this isn't information either. There's a difference between informing people by educating them on how empire moves and compulsively obsessing over empire's every moves. This is the opposite of emotional divestment. You are dedicating all of your time, your thoughts, your creativity to empire, clogging our mental space with garbage, preventing us from connecting to other ideas, imagining alternative discourses, thinking about organizing to bring about another society.
Donald Trump.
I think that there's a point where the strategy of studying your enemy, which is the smart thing to do, turns into morbid fascination, where punching up towards the powerful
President Trump said that he was
is just a desperate attempt at getting your dose of validation by compulsively consuming the very thing that causes you harm.
Trump had what he described as a...
That's an addiction. And I hope you can see why being psychologically dependent on your oppressor is not ideal for your liberation. Meanwhile, you're not organizing, you're not strategizing, you're not imagining alternatives, you are wasting away your emotions. I refuse to place the oppressor and their supporters at the center of my media consumption, of my entertainment, of my emotions. I'm tapping out, I'm too busy, I refuse to give a fuck. Disconnect, get out. But I'll admit it, I wasn't always this enlightened, composed, ethereal being that you see now floating on your screen. I didn't grasp the whole concept of emotional divestment overnight. It took me 2 separate encounters with it, at 2 completely different points of my life to get to where I am now, aggressively preaching it to you. The first time was on my journey to recovering from an abusive relationship. For years and years, I would consume a lot of abuse recovery content here on YouTube to try to make sense of my experience, to heal, and to make sure it wouldn't happen again. And one thing that several of the creators I was following at the time were saying is that healing from abuse means focusing 10% on your abuser, why they did it, how they did it, what it meant when they said this, the different phases of their behavior, the signs that they're about to do this. And 90% is actually focusing on yourself. What negative self-beliefs made you think that you didn't deserve any better? What past situations made the abusive dynamic feel oddly familiar to you even when they hurt? And what were you hoping to resolve in yourself by trying to fix the abuser? And even though I could understand on a rational, intellectual level that at some point I would need to emotionally untether myself from the abuser and the abuse to completely heal, it took me years of work to get to a place where I could begin to feel that emotional liberation. Because when you don't feel safe and grounded, you're obsessed with hyper-analyzing the threats. And of course, this whole time, the threats may be very real. But while you're dedicating all of your energy and your attention to spotting and fending off the threats, you're not healing. You're not living. You're not free. Your entire life still revolves around the abuse or the abuser, and their moves still inform the way that you move through your life. So they're still winning. And I've already alluded to the fact that existing under empire meant that we are stuck in an abusive relationship with systems and powers that we can neither change by ourselves nor escape on our own. So I obviously see many parallels between that experience of abusive relationship and your typical abusive relationship with a partner, for instance. Even at the systemic level, yes, we need to be aware of the oppression and of the multiple ways in which it may affect us and others, but we cannot let it be the center of our attention, nor should we let it dictate our every moves. We need to emotionally divest from this abusive situation. It's as important as materially divesting from it. And then my second encounter with the idea of emotionally divesting from abuse was via decolonial studies and decoloniality. The idea of decentering the hegemonic power as a way to reclaim that power, and the notion that untethering ourselves from the narratives, the perceptions, and the prescriptions of the imperial core are part and parcel of the struggle for liberation according to decoloniality. And that includes what Argentinian decolonial thinker Walter Mignolo would call epistemic delinking. That intellectual and emotional work of delinking, which is intellectually, culturally, and spiritually untethering ourselves from empire, that's what I'm trying to put into practice by emotionally divesting. Okay, empire and coloniality are not exactly the same thing, but for all intents and purposes, in this video, I'm using those terms mostly interchangeably. As Jackson Cole Kula and myself wrote in that same paper on the coloniality of connectedness, full emancipation cannot happen when the focus is still on the oppressor, and when the only metric of decolonial success is the distance to the oppressor. So by seeking to oppose and defeat coloniality, decoloniality inadvertently consents to a binary framing that was imposed by coloniality. Okay, so the YouTube translation of that is that when our only focus is to fight empire, even what we think is a win still ends up being determined in relations to empire. So by doing that, we still haven't escaped the paradigm set by empire. By consenting to fight empire, we are stepping into a ring that was built by empire, and the referee was hired by empire. Until we've reached the state of not giving a fuck, we still aren't free. When black people refuse to explain racism to white people over and over and over and over again, that's emotional divestment. When queer folks refuse to debate the validity of their existence, that's emotional divestment. When the exploited refuse to do the emotional labor of coddling the feelings of their oppressors, that's emotional divestment. As Wole Soyinka says,
"A tiger doesn't proclaim his tigritude, he pounces."
And we conclude in our paper that the final stage of decolonizing, and even discolonizing as we suggest, is just being. It's reaching a state of acoloniality. In the same way, our only hope to be entirely free from empire is to become physically, intellectually, and emotionally untethered from it. It's to create the conditions in which empire is not only fought and defeated, but in which it has lost its power over our emotions. It totally ceases to be even relevant to our existence. And if you still needed one more example of how powerful a tool emotional divestment was, look at the moral panic of conservative people over the loss of their friendships, their relationships, their family ties because they chose to vote for Orange Man. If we all collectively withdrew our attention, our affection, our love, our labor from people who are actively upholding empire, its foundation would begin to shake. Right, so that was the end of part 2. After the break, I'll be back with a new haircut and potentially a new outfit. I haven't decided yet. See you later.
Chapter 3. Not a trauma response.
And we're back. After a very short interruption of 2 months. Yeah, life happened. I did get my haircut in the meantime, twice. But if you, survivor of the current societal collapse, watching this from the future, remember all of the things that happened between December 2024 and February 2025, you'll get why the vibe surrounding the production of this video changed. Initially, I wanted to give this video, my first video essay, my big leap, a sleek professional look, and I thought I was being cute by buying a green screen. But my priorities have changed. The other thing is that, how can I put this? You remember earlier when I said that things were about to get bad? Well, in the interval between me writing and recording that and now, well, things have gone bad. And I'm just not in the mood for sleek, minimalistic aesthetic anymore. I want warmth. I want abundance. I want authenticity. I want everything that society is trying to take away from all of us. So, welcome to the real bubble. Welcome to my real safe space, my real London flat. Welcome to the real world. Now that's better. And if you're enjoying what you're seeing so far and want to support my transition to long format video essays, please like, subscribe, comment on this video, tell your mum, your dad, your granddad, and if you have some extra money lying around after fighting empire and want to support my expenses and mental health, because yeah, spending 3 months on the topic of everything falling apart might have been biting off more than I could chew, but well, subscribe to my Patreon, please. Now let's go back to the video. The first days of Donald Trump in office have been kind of what I expected, but worse, way worse. I've had to crank up the doomometer from a 6 to 11. Apparently, it only took 53 days for Mustache Man to methodically dismantle the German democracy when he got into power in 1933, and the Trump regime is clearly following the same textbook. This is the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein had already theorized in her 2007 book, but only even bolder and even more powerful. At the time, she was talking about disaster capitalism, the strategy in which political actors exploit the chaos in natural disasters, wars and other crises to push through unpopular policies such as deregulation and privatization. This time, though, this shock doctrine is applied to impose a system that is so extreme that the economist and politician Yanis Varoufakis argues that we've already moved past disaster capitalism and have now entered the era of techno-feudalism. In any case, the shock doctrine is going full throttle. The goal is to move fast, faster than we can organize to resist. The goal is to send us into overdrive, to render us ineffective, despondent and panicked. And this is where divesting from empire, learning to tune out the noise, becomes an act of resistance. Empire is trying to traumatize us. At this point, trauma is not a byproduct, it's the goal. So it is absolutely crucial that we do not succumb to the machine by having an incapacitating trauma response to the current events. Divestment is a calculated, targeted, strategic response to empire's attempt to overwhelm us, our nervous system, and our networks of organized resistance. It is super important that we learn to tell the difference between a strategy for liberation and a trauma response. Trauma in itself is valid, always, and having a trauma response is not something that we can control, nor that anybody should be blamed for. It is important, however, to understand how the system, on top of causing the trauma, will try to exploit your trauma response and weaponize it against your own interests and against the interests of collective liberation. Because baby, in this economy you probably don't have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You have persecution. You have exploitation, alienation and oppression. That's what we're suffering from. As Dr. Samah Jabbar, Palestine's head of mental health services, explains, there's nothing post-traumatic about it because people are still in it. It's an ongoing situation that empire puts people in and will continue to have understandable, at times irrational trauma responses as long as empire continues to traumatize us by imposing justified misery on people. And that's why we have no choice but to make sure that whichever way we deal with our ongoing trauma, it doesn't get in the way of us fighting empire. Those two things have to remain two separate things, both happening at the same time. We must not be fooled into confusing our response to trauma with our strategy for liberation. For that, we need to look at what a trauma response would look like in the context of resistance to empire and look at the ways that those responses only make things worse. By looking at the 3 F's of trauma responses: fight, flight or freeze. And let's start with fight. Obviously, I'm not saying that fighting empire is wrong. This entire video is literally about fighting empire, in case you haven't noticed yet. But you cannot fight the good fight if you are panicked, depleted, disconnected, disorganized, and uncoordinated. Fighting as a trauma response would be all of that. This is exactly what the shock doctrine is designed for, to make those who are willing and able to fight run around like headless chicken, to control where our attention goes and where it doesn't go.
They want to reward the attention oligarchs that do what they say and punish the ones that don't. And I think that in that situation, we don't win the attention war by fighting the attention war. We win the attention war by ending it. Take back your attention. Stop giving it away. Be intentional with what gets put into your brain.
So we have to be selective in how we fight and the battles that we fight. I'll give you a concrete example of why. In early January, someone who apparently followed my page and who therefore should have known better was being patronizing and felt entitled to police my tone and my use of sarcasm in my own space. I didn't want to dignify that audacity with a spoken response from me, so instead I replied with a meme by clipping a viral video from 2017 of Canadian First Nation elder Jocelyn Wabano-Iahtal swiftly dealing with a similar case of condescending and disrespectful comment.
Excuse me, did I just hear you correctly?
No.
Excuse me.
Excuse me.
Don't speak to us that way.
Stop right now. You do not speak to us that way. We are human beings, and the way that you're speaking to us
is not acceptable.
All of the relevant context was there, the disrespectful comment and the appropriate response to that disrespect.
Step out, then I don't want to hear from you.
Very simple question. Can I have an answer?
And this is the problem, the way you communicate.
I thought that pretty much everyone was already familiar with this clip, like the haka in Aotearoa's parliament. But clearly I was wrong, and to my surprise, my post of the clip became viral. With nearly 3 million views, this is my most viewed post ever on social media. And I'm not even in it. But what was very interesting about this is how the response to my post made it abundantly clear that there were two categories of people engaging with that video.
You're a guest here. And you don't even know how to speak to us. You don't even recognize the tone in your voice and your delivery.
On the one hand, you had those who immediately got the point. Those were people who moved through the world as colonized bodies, minorities, and who experienced in their skin the exasperation that the indigenous elders were feeling on that stage, having to deal with institutional arrogance and disrespect under the guise of politeness. Those were the people I intended to appeal to with that post because I knew they would get it. There was all of the elements that they needed to recognize the familiar situation that was happening. And that's how memes work. You repurpose content to turn it into a relatable situation for your target audience. And seeing those strong indigenous women stand their ground and call out to white people bullshit was cathartic for my audience. But then you had the other wave of comments by people who watched exactly the same video, but who were like, "What is this? What is this about? What did the journalist say? Why did you cut the original question out? What are you trying to hide? This is so one-sided. What is the context? We need more context!" And then, of course, it quickly devolved into racist attacks against indigenous people and people of color and or women in general, because social media. Those commenters, who I'm sure you would have guessed by now what skin color they tended to be, just couldn't wrap their head around the fact that a public post wasn't made for them. And that it wasn't my duty to explain anything to them, nor to give them the keys and the codes, nor to make it accessible to their level of comprehension. I wasn't talking to them. I refused to get sucked into the fight they were trying to have with me. I was divesting from them. Because here's the thing. No amount of explanation would have appeased them. No amount of arguing, no amount of debating would have made my message intelligible to them. Because what they were missing was not some context. What they were missing was compassion and emotional intelligence. And I might be an educator, but I cannot educate you as a full-grown adult into having compassion. You either got it or you don't. It is not lost on me that the people who were demanding more context to my post were the same kind of people who, the very same week, also didn't think that there was enough context to say with certainty that this was a Nazi salute. You can't reason with people like that. That's why it's important to pick our battles and to know who is worth engaging with or appealing to, and who is a lost cause who is invested in this to tire you, to distract you, or to confuse you. And the next trauma response on our list of responses to avoid when resisting empire is freeze. Freezing in the face of adversity can take two different forms. The first one is trying to intimidate you into doing nothing.
I'm trying to figure out what leverage we actually have. What leverage do we have? They control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It's their government. What leverage do we have?
People will tell you there's nothing you can do. It's too late. Just accept things as they are and be grateful for it. You don't understand. Just stay out of it. And then you have the type of freeze as a trauma response that hypnotizes you into doing nothing. It turns you into a deactivist. Because this system is extremely good at co-opting the language of change, struggle, and liberation to keep things as they are. Let's watch this video together. Take note of how it makes you feel, and we'll discuss it after.
If you have food on your plate, clothes on your body, and a place to sleep, you're richer than 55% of people in the world. If you have money to spend as you wish and freedom to go anywhere you want, you are among the top 8% of the world's population. If you're alive today, with more health than illness, you are more blessed than the million people that won't survive this week. And if you can read and understand this message, you are more fortunate than the 500 million people who cannot see, cannot read, and cannot access the knowledge and information that surrounds us.
So, do you feel like this video was honoring your feelings and empowering you to deal with the world as it is? Or does this video make you feel more docile and accepting? Would you say this was a call to action, making you feel imbued with a sense of responsibility to change things? Or do you feel deactivated, compelled to appreciate things as they are and to just shut up? Because you see, there's a difference between soothing and taming.
Life is not for complaining about pain and sorrows. It's about prioritizing countless other reasons to be grateful for the privileges we often take for granted.
I know that some of my friends are following this account or similar accounts, which from the quick research that I've done has all of the red flags of an AI content farm and goes out of their way to hide any type of connection to a real person that we might know or to a real organization, which is sus. But whatever, if that type of inspirational content is your thing, that's fine. I'm not taking it away from you. If you find it useful, do you know what? Have it. But still be critical of what you consume. What is the message here? Other than telling us to stop complaining and to be grateful for the status quo. No, I'm sorry, no. Complain, be angry, disrupt, riot.
The phrase, if you give them bread and circuses, they will never revolt, has been in circulation for almost 2,000 years. We don't need AP Lit level analysis of a circus performance. I need y'all to understand that the techno-fascists quite literally don't care. It doesn't matter that he did all of that in front of the Antichrist. It doesn't matter. They still have all the power and they still will kill you. And I'm not even saying you can't enjoy the circus. I have my clowns that I pay attention to, but I know that they're clowns. The problem is that y'all are struggling to admit that this is even a circus at all. All of this is fabricated. All of this has been manipulated. All of this is being controlled. Try to envision a future outside of the circus. Like, I'm desperately asking for you to expect better for your life.
I'm all for finding and practicing joy, even in the face of oppression and inequality. And I'm all for acknowledging our privilege so that we can assess the power we can yield to impulse change. But that's not what these videos are about, unfortunately. This is encouraging us to be content with the way things are and count ourselves lucky we're benefiting from this system as it is. Well, no thank you. I'll be ungrateful all day long. Don't fall for the voices that encourage you to prioritize your personal comfort over your connection to the world and to the collective. Or the voices that will promise you personal success within the current system just so you don't try to change it. Like black capitalism, for instance. They're trying to make you freeze, to deactivate you.
It's not an accident that yoga has been watered down in the West. And it's not just yoga.
Look at the civil rights movement. Once a movement for economic, social, political justice, and now relegated to MLK quotes on a coffee mug, or corporate platitudes about equality while dismantling DEI programs. What happened to the socialist roots of the struggle? Oh, right, they got sanitized and erased to help people feel more comfortable in their colonialist, capitalist norms. Same with yoga, a practice of social, personal, complete transformation and liberation, repackaged as smoothies, flat abs, wellness routine, even now yoga boobs in plastic surgery. It's not an accident. We need to be paying attention to this. Selling us wellness while stopping us from asking too many questions.
And then we had our third trauma response, which is flight. Running away from the reality of empire to avoid dealing with it. That's escapism. In our forthcoming paper, when my co-authors Kula, Jackson Cole and myself talk about dreaming of an acolonial world, that also means imagining a world where empire, as a product of coloniality, no longer shapes our society, our lives, and our connectedness, and where the damage of coloniality has been repaired. The problem with dreaming of a better world is that if it is not accompanied with a strategy to get there and an honest assessment of how far we have left to go, then we take the risk of letting the dream disconnect us from the harsh reality of the struggle. And when that happens, dreaming, instead of being this powerful tool that is supposed to give us the courage to fight, becomes a drug that can make us apathetic, resigned in the face of injustice and oppression, and that is escapism.
I think, in fact, there's a lot of people who are just preparing to roll over to fascism, and that's been really disheartening to see. Make peace with the fact that we are in fighting times. You can come to revolution, or the revolution can come to you, but it's coming. It's coming because the systems that take so much from us, that hurt us, while claiming to provide for us and protect us, are falling apart, and they become inherently violent, much more violent when they do.
One of the aspects of escapism is people who are so privileged and accustomed to comfort that at the first sight of social injustice, they're out. They're the let's not get political crowd, the don't talk to me about genocide, it's too low vibration crowd. Or the latest version, the let's use our insane wealth to escape the United States and live in a cruise ship for the next 4 years of Trump's second term, even though our wealth and privilege already makes us the least vulnerable of US citizens crowd.
And if you're unhappy with the US election outcome, you're in luck. You can now go on a cruise. You can cruise off to the sunset and return in time for the next one. A 4-year-long cruise package named Skip Forward is pitched as a solution to escape Trump's presidency. A single room starts at $388,000, while a double could set you back around $485,000. Imagine all the celebrities that would be on it.
Escapism is the refusal to engage with the pain and the struggles of those whose lived experiences exist outside of our own privilege, in the name of inner peace and mindfulness, as if that was even possible to achieve by disconnecting yourself from others and by throwing your empathy out of the window. And I know that we're only human. We aspire to living in peace, comfort and abundance. In the face of constant horror and injustice, it can be very tempting to prioritize our comfort over our sense of empathy. I, for one, spent quite some time since October 2023, as someone with a platform who has spoken up a lot about the Palestinian genocide, but not exclusively about it. I spent some time grappling with my role and responsibility I have to not provide escapism to people who haven't actually earned a moment of respite, who haven't borne witness to the suffering of others, who haven't done the work of understanding their positionality in a system that may destroy all of us, but not to the same degree. And that's because I've been grappling with this possible responsibility that I have of not providing escapism to people who haven't earned it, that I wrote about it in an essay published by Packhaus de Zwijger. In this book, Closing Perspectives on Designing Cities for All, where I argue that not only is escapism morally corrupt, but also it just will not make you feel any better in the long run. Let me pretend to read you a passage when in reality I'm just still reading from the prompter. Escapism and the ability to carry on disconnected from the suffering of others for the sake of your own comfort is the very foundation of settler colonialism, is the triumph of empire. Many self-help gurus, mindfulness influencers, and celebrity mental health professionals have come out to advocate for some version of escapism, encouraging people to disconnect, to center themselves, and block out the unbearable reality of what is happening in a country far, far away. Those suggestions are coming from a place of privilege. And by centering individual comfort and numbing you to the plight of others, they contribute to upholding the system. And although they may appear as obvious self-care solution, the long-term effects of tuning out only worsens the disconnect between you and humanity, which ultimately leads to more pain, more loneliness, and more isolation from the transcending collective experience of processing emotions in community. Can you tell that I'm a former model? So escapism is basically the political equivalent of burying your head in the sand. It's not going to make anything around you better, and it's also not going to make you feel any better in the long run. In our current media landscape, where our attention is currency, the most efficient way for competing media outlets and social media platforms to get our attention is through rage baiting. Feeling enraged by what is happening in our society is very much a normal, healthy feeling when we exist inside an oppressive system. But the rage manufactured by the baiting of institutions and corporate entities,
criminal drug dealers, the rapists, the murderers,
takes our healthy sense of injustice and unrest and completely hijacks it, diverting that righteous rage to target other victims of the system instead of those who actually pull the strings and benefit from this system. Cue all the tech bros and corporations swiftly turning their coats and blaming DEI for all of their problems, as if the problems of Facebook, Walmart, Amazon, and Boeing was that they were too anti-racist and not supportive enough of masculine aggression, whatever that means. So when we find ourselves stuck between messages of society that try to deactivate us, to make us docile on one hand, and messages of society that try to keep us overactivated in a permanent state of rage and fear, also to keep us docile on the other hand, it might be tempting, as we're trying to divest from empire, to explore the third way, accelerationism. How can I describe accelerationism? Have you ever heard of the parable of the bison in the storm? It says that when the snowstorm arrives, unlike the stupid cows who panic and try to run away from the storm with their feminine energy, the fierce bison charges into the storm because it instinctively knows that the quicker it goes through it, the quicker it will be over. And that's accelerationism for you. If, like the snowstorm for the bisons, going through a period of fascism is inevitable for our societies, then we might as well bite the bullet and get it over with by just giving it a little push and accelerate towards it, hence the name. Not because we like fascism, but because we're playing 4D chess and we can foresee its collapse once everybody gets a taste of what it's really like. There's only one small problem with accelerationism and with the parable of the bison for that matter. They're both complete and utter bullshit. Or bison shit. See, bisons don't move towards the storm, it's just that they have a protective layer of fat and callous skin on their face, which essentially turns their head into a natural shield against the elements when they face in the direction the wind is coming from. But they don't actually walk into the storm, let alone charge into it. They are no more clever or courageous than the cow. They have no instinctive wisdom about getting closer to the end of the storm, and they're certainly not doing shit about it. They just adopt the position that requires the least effort for them during the storm, and that is a perfect metaphor for the people who buy into the accelerationism mindset. They're all for going through the storm quickly, of course, because deep down they know they'll be fine. They might be affected, yeah, but they're clearly not the most affected, and they know it, and they're certainly not going to be the first in line of fire. Accelerationists make the fundamental mistake of forgetting that fascism is at its core profoundly unfair. It's not a state that we can temporarily tolerate for the greater good and quickly recover from once it's been defeated. Fascism corrupts and harms not just people, but humanity as a whole. And although I can say with certainty that this phase will be over eventually, it's not guaranteed that we'll recover from it. Climate change, for instance, is an unprecedented challenge for humanity, and there's no blueprint for it, no reference in history that we can learn from. I saw this graph resurfacing immediately after the US elections. It presents the pattern of alternating between fascism and centrism as a cycle. And according to this post, we should be reaching the bottom of this cycle, where the far right drives the economy off a cliff, lowers standards of public life, and generally makes everything objectively worse. And that might be the case when the far right gets into power in countries of the global south. But when we're talking about hegemonic powers of the global north, and especially in the case of the United States, the economy and the far right are besties. They serve each other and are two arms of empire driven by the same goals. So I certainly would not count on liberal economic interests to organically hoist us out of fascism like it has in other countries before. I mean, take a look around. Does it seem to you like the class of oligarchs ruling the world's economy are in any rush to move us away from fascism? Are you crazy? This is their dream come true. So yeah, I think accelerationism makes a grave mistake in assuming that the end of the snowstorm is inevitable and near. Oh yeah, I do agree with accelerationists that people will soon come to regret their choice, but by the time they realize that, it might be too late to change course. That's exactly what Project 2025 is designed for. Fascism will fail people, but it will not fail those who have the power to maintain it. And if we look at history, the conditions that made societies reach a tipping point that started revolutions in the past, such as social inequality, concentration of wealth, exploitation of the masses, violation of the social contracts by the ruling class, dispossession, alienation, all that jazz. Well, if we are to believe the patterns of history, we are due a revolution in about 30 years ago. Yep, we did it, guys. We broke history. For whatever reason, empire as it rules the world today seems to have developed an immunity against the factors that provoked the end of feudalism, the toppling of European absolute monarchies, or the fall of the USSR. Somehow, our society never seems to reach a boiling point, and no one can say for certain that it ever will. Those who claim otherwise are lying to you. Last month, in conversation with Sobhi Khatib, a Palestinian writer based in Amsterdam, I asked him, how come when seeing what Israel did to Gaza and knowing that they are next, how come the West Bank had not risen up? And he told me, you don't revolt when you have a mortgage to pay. And this is it, guys. This is how capitalism got us all locked in, from Jenin to Khartoum to Goma to London to Miami. If empire manages to keep Palestine under the boot with capitalism, what makes you think that it can't keep the US and the whole of the global north under the same boot indefinitely? Late-stage capitalism has been late for much longer than it should have, and it keeps growing bolder and stronger. Yes, I believe that we are living a societal collapse, but I really don't think that capitalism will be the first bolt to fail. What we are already witnessing happening first is a breakdown of all the little safety nets that the most vulnerable and marginalized rely on to stay afloat. So the leftists who think secretly, or not so secretly, that the regime of Orange Man will unintentionally bring about the end of capitalism, they're just really throwing the most vulnerable under the bus. And there's also an underlying callousness in accelerationism, a sense of deserved punishment for having made the wrong choices. Oh, so you wanted fascism? Well, I'll show you fascism. Fuck around and find out. But that's forgetting that those who have the most to lose aren't necessarily those who made that choice. And even those who did, they made that choice because they were conditioned to think that nothing else would save them. In many cases, they're the victims too. That's why people with a pathological lack of empathy love accelerationism. Because it gives them a political justification, a moral reason to cheer on people's suffering. It allows them to not engage emotionally with what is actually happening.
So this take is egregious, it's heartless, and it's a clear example of spiritual bypassing in the face of devastation. When people lose their homes, their loved ones, and a sense of their stability, it's not liberation. It's destruction, it's grief, it's trauma, it's cruelty. Real liberation isn't found in devastation, it's found in justice. It's found in community and rebuilding with dignity, and people impacted by this disaster don't need your poetic musings. They need shelter and safety and resources and compassion. And if you're watching tragedy from a distance, you don't get to reframe it as something positive.
There's a point where you've zoomed out so far to supposedly see the bigger picture that you've lost your connection to humanity and the reality of people's lived experience. You're too far gone. Now, I know not everyone who dabs into accelerationism does it out of cruelty. It's also a valid coping mechanism, trying to find a silver lining, a glimmer of hope in a situation that we find unbearably bleak. Unbearably biblically bleak, probably. When Bernie Sanders lost the 2020 Democratic primaries, or rather, when they got stolen from him, I genuinely thought that we had just lost our last chance to save the world as we know it. And I still think that. And although I wasn't wishing for it, I believe that, as a silver lining, a Biden victory at least would further expose the hypocrisy of liberalism and empire. And it sucks to be right sometimes.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
So now that every day that goes by confirms that we are, in fact, living in the darkest timeline, I am ready for a new world, ASAP. And that's one thing I have in common with the accelerationists. But the main difference is in the method to get there and at what cost. How do I contribute to creating the conditions for a revolution without sacrificing the already powerless? That's a question we should all be asking ourselves first. Well, my personal rule of thumb is to make sure that I'm in community with people who are more marginalized than me and who I know will be affected more than me at first. And I pay attention to what they're saying. If they're ready, I'm ready. And I'll take instructions from them, not the other way around. As long as I wouldn't be the most impacted by a structural change, then it's not my call to make. And in the meantime, well, I'll just be here in my corner trying to convince you on top of my soapbox.
I've seen the way that social media has shifted and changed. We are seeing class solidarity more than we've ever seen it before. It's insane to reach this point and recognize that social media is one of the big battlegrounds right now for our society.
But I promise I wouldn't be portraying such a bleak reality if I didn't believe that there's a way out of this. We may have broken history, but that also means that it's time to be creative. I promise in chapter 4 I'll talk about brighter futures. You're gonna stay, right? We're nearly there. I started writing this script right after the re-election of Orange Man, but as I'm recording this a few weeks into his regime, well, accelerationism has already become obsolete. Nazi salutes, mass deportation, executive orders, undoing civil rights and protections for minorities. There is no distance left to accelerate over. We are in fascism. Yes, all of us, including me here in London. To different degrees we are in fascism for sure, but we are. Because the United States as our global hegemon has entered the next phase of its decline, and that means that most of the world is coming down with it. And since we are in it now, I'm observing an updated version of accelerationism, which I'm gonna call accommodationism. Okay, turns out clearly other people have come up with this term way before I did, but I didn't know that at the time of recording, sorry. Now that it's here, they accommodate for it, but still swearing that it's done in the name of anti-fascism, under the guise of being populists or anti-establishment. They sympathize with the fascists. They bargain with the fascists. They try to appease the fascists to flatter them. They want to have a beer with the fascists.
I do have to give you guys credit for a revolution well done.
And there you have it. The surprise fourth F of the trauma responses that I was saving for the very end. The well-studied trauma response to abuse called fawning. And surprise, surprise, that too is not a strategy for liberation either. Because the fascist can never be appeased. The fascist turns his inner wounds, his feeling of alienation and disconnect, into a political ideology. The unconscious goal of the fascist is to make society in the image of the desolate landscape that he feels inside, so that he can finally feel normal. And there's no way to accommodate for that. It's a futile task, and it's dangerous at that. I'd rather not walk into the leopard's enclosure to accommodate them, thank you very much. I never thought the leopards would eat my face. My coping mechanism and my form of resistance to empire is to do the opposite of what a fascist does. I look inwards. I try to heal my wounds. I seek to create and deepen connections with my authentic self, with my kin, with the land, and I try to tap into the feeling of love, abundance, and belonging that is the baseline of all humans. I try to project it outwards, investing it into the society that I'm hoping to see. And as it turns out, some cultures have been practicing exactly that for thousands of years. So now that we've got a firm grasp on divestment from empire, let's have a look at how we can reinvest our efforts and our imagination, learning from cultures and experiences at the margin of empire.
Reforesting our imaginaries.
And I realized that I had fallen victim to one of white supremacy's greatest weapons, the war on imagination.
In my therapy session following the re-election of Trump, after my obligatory venting about the political implications of the results, my therapist asked me how I was feeling about it. And as a socially aware, therefore overthinker autist, this question used to anger me because I am a firm believer that the separation between feeling and thinking, on top of being a colonized dichotomy, does not apply to the autistic mind. We think through our emotions and we feel through thinking. But after years of decolonial therapy, I have learned to take this prompt for what it is, an invitation to tune into my body and listen to its faint, timid voice in times when my mind tends to speak so loudly. So how was I feeling about it all? I took a moment and realized that the main emotion I was feeling was fear. Not really fear for myself in the present. I am sitting quite far from the US, and despite my multiply marginalized identities, I have the material conditions and I enjoy certain privileges that will most likely shield me from the most negative effects of whatever policy Orange Man and his goons are already enacting and will enact in the next 4 years. No, what I really fear is for my future. And for the many, many different collective, interconnected futures that were all sentenced to death on the 5th of November 2024 and that are being eradicated right now, as we speak. Among those attacked futures, some of them would have been my futures too. I was raised by a Marxist Trotskyist mom, and revolutionary ideologies run in my entire family. But up until 2 years ago, I was never much of a revolutionary myself. I was always aware and critical of the injustices of our society, and I knew that a revolution was bound to happen one day, but I didn't really see it happening in my lifetime. It wasn't really part of my futures. So I was more invested in learning how to get by and thrive in this effed up society than in dreaming of burning it to the ground and start over. Well, I have changed. What really did it for me was the aftermath of the 7th of October 2023 and the subsequent Western-sponsored final stage of the genocide of the Palestinian people by Israel. That's the moment when all the masks fell off. From that point on, to me, empire stopped even bothering to pretend. All of the supposed lessons of anti-racism from the BLM uprising were trampled on. The definitions and understanding of terms like genocide, crime against humanity, terrorism were completely obliterated just because this time it was a Western power and ally doing it. In 2023, all of the pledges to tackle white supremacy, to not fall into white fragility, the promises to listen, all of the inspiring books that people were buying, the workshops, the conferences, the pledges, the land acknowledgements, all of that went up in smoke, making it plainly obvious that they had only been performative virtue signaling all along. The lessons of the horror of the Holocaust, the legitimacy of the United Nations, any semblance of international rule of law, international treaties, international diplomacy, and the so-called universal values of human rights, justice and freedom all were defecated on by empire in 2023 without battling an eyelid because white supremacy felt threatened and demanded that an example be made. As Dr. Jason Hickel puts it in an Instagram post, it was like watching in real time what Aimé Césaire described in Discourse on Colonialism. Liberals who wax lyrical about equality and rights and the rule of law, but are happy to violate every one of these principles when it comes to the colonized. So the books I read, the people I've met, the more I could see all the potentials, the more violently I felt that the fields of possible was being taken away from us. Genocide was being perpetrated on people, but also on their futures and, by consequence, on our collective futures. and it's to describe the way that empire, specifically with the aid of so-called AI, was destroying our ability to see represented or even imagine a future in which the Palestinians exist, let alone thrive, that the artist Amira Kawash coined the term Futuricide. And even though the futuricide of the Palestinian people is currently the most striking example, futuricide has been a huge tool of coloniality against all colonized people and all oppressed groups for a long time, and we're seeing it in action right now. So it's been very clear to us, even those of us like me with Western privileges, but also existing in colonized bodies and experiencing some of the multiple forms of colonial violence, that the futuricide of the Palestinian was also a project against our futures, and it was merely a rehearsal for what is to come. It's an attack on our ability to imagine ourselves out of the shackles of empire. The field of possibles is being taken away from all of us. To the most oppressed, it materializes as an ongoing genocide, but to all of us, it is also a futuricide. So going back to the year 2023, that was the year when I personally unsubscribed from empire and from its promised futures. If empire itself wasn't invested in maintaining the facade of its own cosmology, its myths and its supposed values, why the fuck should I be? When Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar use symbolism, and they do it really well at a time when it's particularly needed, but they use symbolism to rehabilitate the symbols of empire in the name of reclamation, all the while upholding the structures of oppression of empire. What narrative are they trying to restore exactly? What do you think that does to challenge empire? Why would I, a black, queer, colonized person, work harder than empire itself to defend its professed values that it spends its time invalidating? The leopards are coming to eat my face too, and I know it. So thanks to my post-2023 clarity, and to the extent that my material conditions make it tenable for me, I will no longer bargain with empire, no longer plead with empire, no longer believe or trust empire. And I have absolutely no interest in debating agents of empire, and also no interest in having a beer with them.
But you know what it is when you disagree on something and then you fight about it and then you have a beer afterwards? That's called America.
My journey to divestment from empire stepped up a gear in 2023, but I still needed a goal. I was missing something to look forward to, a choice of alternative futures. And then came 2024. Still against the backdrop of ongoing genocides and societal collapse, that year left me yearning for answers. I needed to populate my imaginary. Surely there's got to be more to humankind than this. This is when a multiplicity of answers and solutions, an abundance of possible decolonized and liberated futures presented themselves to me. I had a spiritual and ancestral encounter with Candomblé in Brazil, an African diasporic spiritual cosmology, and I read books. My ADHD allowed me to. I read books like The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which challenges a linear, unidirectional story of evolution and progress of society. And that made me realize that for most of the history of our ancestors, societies were cyclical, and collective societal decisions would regularly go against our understanding of progress now, putting civilizations on a path that we now wrongly interpret as going backwards. As a fall of civilization, when in the reality of the time, it was a mature and conscious collective decision to turn a page and move to a next chapter more in line with the circumstances of the times. And that should be relevant for the times we're going through right now. If our ancestors knew how to reshuffle their societies all the time, why are we putting up with this system? Whatever happened to imagining different futures, experimenting with them, playing and creating societies? Why are we stuck here? 2024 really made me realize how absurd our situation was, and how abnormal it was for our society to be so immutable, while making sense to so few of us. Why have we abandoned so many futures? I wanted to imagine again, so I looked to those who were the best positioned to imagine other futures. In her book Imagination, a Manifesto, Rura Benjamin quotes Arundhati Roy as saying, "The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, and imagination that has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment." And so in 2024 I did. I took the time to meet, share moments, and expose myself to the thoughts and experiences of people who existed partially outside of the paradigm of coloniality. I sat down and spent time with Black and Indigenous people in Brazil, with Atope, a medicine woman in Guadeloupe. I also read and listened to the work of Indigenous voices, such as Lauren Tynan from Tasmania, Jenny Nunes and Ailton Krenak from Brazil. People who I couldn't credit enough for the influence they've had on this final section of the video essay. I wasn't going to change the world in 2024, and I'm probably not going to change the world in 2025, but I know change is possible. Focusing, as Rura Benjamin says, on what could be amid the harsh reality of what is. But this is how you create new futures. And I quite liked my cute little futures that I created in 2024. Alas, the whole lot got slaughtered by the re-election of Trump. Yeah, funny that, but for a moment I'd almost forgotten that some people really don't like my futures. Those futures haven't done anything to them. They don't even exist yet. But some people hate them just because, and they will do everything in their power to kill them. So ladies, gents and beyond, in 2025 we are gonna have to fight for our futures before those futures get killed.
Our problem is not lack of education. Our problem is we don't have counter indoctrination and counter propaganda. This is not simply about teaching a student. It's about waging intellectual and psychic warfare. We have to be propagandists. We have to employ counter indoctrination. It's not a fair fight, and we should not fight fair.
We're going to have to fight for a future where empire doesn't take up all of our focus and worry. We're going to have to wage what the Brazilian activist Ailton Krenak calls the war of the narratives, so that we can begin to imagine and narrate worlds where your value isn't determined by how productive you are or your ability to serve power. Worlds where your connections to other people, to the land, to life and to yourself aren't measured by how much you can extract from them or how much they can extract from you. A world where the oppressor simply ceases to be relevant. Now you might think that this inspiring wishful thinking can only be achieved once your material conditions allow you to start dreaming, that this dream can only come from a place of privilege. But if you refuse to have the audacity to imagine a better world, well, other people are already doing it for you. We already live in someone else's imagination. The world we live in was imagined by people who really don't care about us. Inequality is not a failure of imagination. It's the result of powerful people imagining ways in which society can keep serving them. And once they're done imagining, they have all the means to make their dreams come to fruition. Our present was once someone else's imagined future. How do you like it?
Our wildest ideas of what we think is possible come from somebody else's imagination and not ours. Ideas like colonizing Mars, growing your own organs, a 27-floor palace with a snow room that spits snowflakes from the walls. These are ideas that could be considered crazy, but are now imaginable, even possible. But who is doing this imagining and making their imaginations reality? It's certainly not me or people who look like me.
We know that history is written by the victors. But the other side of the same coin that we don't discuss enough is that our futures are currently being written by the victors too. Our futures are being imagined by our oppressors right now. Look at the craze about AI that is being shoved in every possible piece of technology when nobody asked for it, making the internet objectively worse than it was. That's some billionaire's wet dream of creativity and productivity being imposed on us in real time. What about everything being subscription-based nowadays? The fact that we own nothing, but still have to pay for it for eternity, is certainly not the future that the masses were asking for, and yet that's what we're getting. The winners, aka the oppressors in today's society, cannot imagine themselves as anything else than the oppressor in their desired futures. So what position do you think you have in their imagined future? Yup, us and them, we don't want the same thing. We're not fighting for the same futures, and they are not compatible. Whenever agents of empire and people whose interests are fundamentally opposed to ours keep pontificating about we should come together, if we want to achieve this, we shouldn't be divisive, weeing all over our face, they're trying to trick us, right? In times of social unrest, we always hear those calls for coming together to form a single line behind one universal or even just national project of society, one common future, because apparently the solution for our societal collapse is more unity, they say. But I ask, unity with who? And unity for what? Why would a cancer patient in the United States want to unite with a healthcare insurer as their next round of chemotherapy prescribed by the medical team is being denied by the insurer? Whose interests would that unity serve? Would you expect a rape victim to unite with their rapist in the name of peace? Would you call that justice? Would you expect minimum wage workers to unite behind their billionaire CEO to help him maximize profit for his shareholders by firing 20% of the workforce? Are the workers supposed to cheer that on for unity? Are we supposed to unite with our oppressor? Do you expect me to unite behind Donald Musk and Elon Trump, whose class interests are fundamentally opposed to mine and whose futures call for the eradication of my futures? Do you really believe that my liberation can be achieved by rallying behind the flag of a nation state whose economic and military imperial might was built on genocide, epistemicide, looting, extraction, exploitation, slavery and colonization? Even if it wanted to, such an entity whose principles have remained unchanged throughout the centuries would not be able to produce the tools for our collective liberation now. Whichever way you look at it, unity with empire cannot be conducive of liberation. So I'm sorry, but no, actually. We don't need more unity. We need more diversity. We need multiplicity. We need concomitance of options. We need to expand our field of possibles, not shrink it. We don't need global governance because, as we can clearly see, that inevitably ends up consolidating empire and hegemony. We need global co-responsibility instead. Rather than collapsing our multiple futures into one single monofutures for the whole of humankind, we need a profusion of futures, branching out and expanding in every direction. And we need the possibility to choose our paths among these possible futures. In this society, the interests of the huge majority have zero impact on the political decisions that affect them, their livelihood, their work, or their identity. We should be able to discuss and decide what feels right for us at any given time, both as individual and as collective, be it as a family, as a community, as a people, or as a nation, or as any combination of whichever social unit makes the most sense for us in any given context. We should be able to play with possible futures, see what works, experiment, make mistakes, change our minds, try something else. And I'm not saying that based on an unrealistic, distant future utopia. I am saying that because this has been, in fact, how people have existed and organized societies on this planet for most of history of humankind. This current version of society that we live in now, as a monoculture, under empire, capitalism and coloniality, this is the outlier. This is the insult to our fundamental nature. This is the unrealistic dystopia that has proven to not work.
This is the bad place.
So, let's say you've had enough. You're a US refugee with a valid passport, which is becoming difficult, especially for trans people at the moment. And you're ready not only to divest, but to completely opt out of empire. What do? Well, simple. You use your savings to buy a plot of land in Costa Rica to live in a commune with your friends and your polycule of lovers according to your principles of community and equality. You heal your connection to the land and you live off selling your art on Etsy and give online classes on mindfulness and meditation. Yay! Well, congratulations. By trying to escape empire, you've turned into a digital nomad, a capitalist tech entrepreneur, and a settler colonizer. Well, yeah, what did you think? You buying land made you take part in the colonial imposition of land ownership as the only valid legal relationship between people and land, which consequently delegitimizes indigenous stewardship and caretaking of the land. And buying that property, which was cheap for you with your foreign money but not for the locals, contributed to gentrification, raising prices in the area even further and putting it out of reach of the local population, who is now forced to abandon their subsistence economy and switch to a service economy, serving, well, you and your friends and your fellow country folks and clients, because that's the only way the locals can pay their bills, now that your connected commune is using up most of the water and electricity supply, and now that your newly built yoga ashram blocks the local community from accessing the river that they depended on for centuries. Now, does that make you a bad person? Well, my hypothetical example was a bit excessive, so yes, in this instance, you would be an asshole. But the point is, the system is forcing all of us to become that guy. My current lifestyle is closer to that caricature than it is to an indigenous lifestyle. I'm well aware of that. I don't have a choice. Nobody does. That's because as long as we exist in a global system that relies on induced scarcity, resources extraction, and power hierarchies, there is no way for you, for me, for anybody to emancipate ourselves from oppression without in turn oppressing someone else. That's a bit of a problem. Not just because the system is bad, but because only this one system is available to us. Look at capitalism. Nowhere on this planet is free from capitalism. Yes, even China, even Cuba, Venezuela, even North Korea have their entire economies dictated by the fact that they exist within a capitalist context and have to contend with the same hegemonic powers as we do in the West. Look at white supremacy. No society is free from white supremacy. There isn't a country where being white isn't a systemic privilege and where being dark-skinned black isn't a systemic disadvantage. Even in countries where white or black people don't represent a significant demographic. And look at coloniality. There isn't a national border that wasn't directly or indirectly shaped by colonization. Even for countries that weren't technically colonized, their neighbors were. As for the colonizing powers, well, colonization affected the colonizers too, you know, and shaped societies in the global north as much as it shaped the global south. So where does empire come into this? Well, empire is the hierarchical structure that underpins and serves capitalism, white supremacy, and coloniality. And also the patriarchy, which I'm not covering in this video, but is very much part of it too. Empire is the military, the economy, and the industry. It's the legal system that protects only power and capital. It's international law that is only used to police black and brown people. It's the governments, the corporations, your boss, the landlords, and the shareholder class. And if you've been paying attention, yes, I've been talking about empire this whole time, and it's only now, at the very end, that I get to define what I mean by it. But that's on purpose. I hate definitions. I wanted you to feel what I mean by empire, to picture in your mind the multiple ways in which empire affected your life, before getting to discuss definitions. I know what people are like on the internet. I don't want to let the conversation get derailed by debates around semantics and labels. But hey, if empire means something else to you, feel free to disagree in the comments. Meanwhile, I hope that I've made the case that divesting from empire must also entail unsubscribing from the narratives of coloniality, the hierarchies of white supremacy, and the false promises of capitalism. They are all mutually dependent and intertwined into one single meta-system, one monoculture of oppression. And I know that divesting is hard to do, even as a mental exercise. I'm not sure who was the first person to say this, it's unclear, but it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. Look at our fictions. And that's pretty ironic, because if you look at the history of humanity, us existing in this one monoculture produced by this monosystem is a first. It's historically abnormal. This is a glitch. There isn't a single person or living creature on this planet, for that matter, who doesn't currently exist under the theoretical authority of a nation state. This is new. This European concept of organizing society, which didn't even apply to huge chunks of Europe as late as the 20th century, you know, the century that I and most of you viewers were born in. Why did we decide that this was the only and universally valid way of organizing society? Does it look to you like it's working for everybody? Because it doesn't to me. I'd even go as far as to say that the concept of nation states was invented to replace and eradicate community as an intermediary level of collective governance. Look, we have the individual, the sacrosanct individual that consumerism needs and worships, and then one level above that we have the nuclear family that the conservatives love to about because they fantasize it as a mini totalitarian society that they have absolute control over. And then after the family, as a subunit of society, we immediately jump to the state, entirely skipping the community, even though the community level of social organization has historically been the main place of identity emergence, of epistemic creation, as well as the main source of relationality and connectedness. The state as a structure of collective organization might be valid for some things, like I would say healthcare, transport infrastructure, communication, food, water, electricity production and distribution, ironically all the things that capitalism seeks to take away from the state. But not everything collective makes sense to be managed at a state level. And here when I talk about the state, that also includes the regional administrative subdivisions of the state, as long as they're a top-down manifestation of the authority of the state, rather than organically formed by bottom-up collective desire to form community. If the state demands that no other form of governance can exist inside, alongside, or even outside of it, that's an antisocial design flaw. Any system that requires complete monopoly to function is bound to fail, and so it should. This is why, for as much diversity as we think exists in the world, we all actually live under one same global empire. We are all stuck in this one capitalist colonial monoculture. And that is, in my opinion, the biggest crime of colonization. Not just its violent nature, because other systems, including indigenous systems, produce violence too, but the fact that no other system in the history of our species have so completely succeeded at imposing themselves as the only unavoidable, inescapable, total system. Therefore, the only way to allow possible alternatives to emerge and recreate the diversity and the possibilities of choice that our ancestors have always known is to dismantle it. We cannot evolve out of capitalism. We cannot vote our way out of coloniality. No amount of book reading alone will topple white supremacy. By becoming the only system in existence, global empire dug its own grave by making it impossible for humankind to break out of it without smashing it into pieces, because nothing in it is designed for happiness and prosperity. But enough talking about empire. You got the message. Society is fucked up. Everything is falling apart. We got it. Sorry I went theoretical again, and I'm tired of it myself. Let me keep it real. My suggestion of divesting from empire is a temporary fix. It's more of a mental health advice than a clear strategy for revolution. I know that. So what can we do concretely? Because, I'd admit it, so far I've cancelled, as they say, the nation state, the idea of national or racial unity with the oppressor, the Christian nuclear family. I've cancelled moving abroad, buying land. I've ruined inspirational poetry on Instagram for you. The bisons are just fat-headed cows now. Cancelled. I've burst your bubble about Michelle Obama, Beyonce. Heck, even colonization is bad now. We can't have anything anymore. This is wokeness gone mad.
Stop it! Stop it! You've gone mad! Mad, I tell you, mad!
Okay, but in all seriousness though, the reason why I'm pointing out these issues is to help you, and help myself, detach from the systems that hurt us all, in the hope that we can make room for us to imagine something different. But I'm fully aware that constantly bashing the things that we've grown to accept as normal, because that's all we've ever known, without proposing an exciting vision of what we could have instead, well, that creates a void. And that makes me look like the Grinch trying to steal Christmas. Of course, I don't think it's fair to expect the people talking about an issue to also be the ones coming up with the solution. It is not the duty of the person pointing out the problem to fix it. Right. But I think that the classic mistake that activists and people in progressive circles often make is that we expect people to give up what they have and what they know because that's the right thing to do, in the name of moral purity and social justice. Because in a context where people already feel like they're losing everything and that their identity and lifestyle is under threat, well, telling them that the little they have is wrong, that is not quite appealing to the masses. Take consumerism, for instance. Yeah, it's bad. Yeah, it's killing the planet. But as Ashton Berry, aka The Collectress, says, consumerism is tied to identity building. We can't expect people to divest from what they believe passively identifies them without support. We need to connect with people with compassion and warmth, not just righteousness and doom. Honestly, some of my followers and mutuals who I completely align with politically, ideologically, philosophically, I look at their posts and their 50 IG stories a day and I think to myself, I love you, sibling, but I would not want to go to a party with you, and I don't think you would even like me in real life. Look at how we all came together and had a fun time discussing Luigi Mangione and how hot he is, all the while also bringing the inequity of the US healthcare system to the forefront of the conversation. Is he a hero? You already know what I think of lone hero narratives. Of course he's not. Did he start a revolution? Doesn't look like it to me. But he was a spark. Now, I don't know when a revolution will happen, but I know that when it does, it will have started with a spark like this one. So we need to connect with people by giving them more sparks, giving them something to aspire to, so that people eventually feel ready to let go of the bad things, instead of us constantly trying to take things away from them all the time. Because after 4 years of building my platform making explicit the systemic inequality of our society, even I get to the point where I need a spark. I want to be presented with solutions. I'm desperate for other futures. I know that freeing myself from empire will not only happen by battling empire, nor by simply divesting from it. At the same time as I'm disconnecting from what is corrupting my humanity, I need to reconnect with ways of knowing, ways of doing, and ways of being outside of the monoculture of empire. Brazilian indigenous thinker Ailton Krenak says that the monoculture is the monolithic imposition of one world only. So there cannot be one single solution to combat it. Instead, the answer can only be multiple and diverse. The opposite of the monoculture is the forest. When Jenny Nunez says those words, she taps into the indigenous wisdom of the Guarani people. And that statement is true both metaphorically and literally. It goes far beyond re-greening our built environment. It's about bringing back a diversity of ways of existing and the ability to choose what feels right for us and our social group at any given time. Reforesting our futures is about re-indigenizing ourselves and our societies. As I've stated at the beginning, I don't make contents to follow the news, but tragically here, with the news of the LA wildfires still raging at the time of writing, it's the news that writes itself into my content now.
Indigenous nations across the continent used fire as a tool. When the fires occurred in Australia, they were wise enough to admit that it was not just due to climate change. It was mostly due to hundreds of years of suppression, illegalization, and prohibition of Aboriginal fires. Aboriginal people used fire for tens of thousands of years to create healthy, thriving, biodiverse ecosystems. If we're going to fireproof what's left of Southern California forests and safeguard these living treasures, we must empower local Indigenous people, like my friend Jessa and others, to do their traditional cultural burns, which are done carefully, at the right time of year, at low intensity to heal the land and protect human and animal communities.
More and more when people move into these lands, the thought of fire sends chills up and down their spine. But that's only because the fire has been taken from us and we have overgrowth galore. So now more than ever, we need to start tending to these overgrowths and start creating safe, healthy fire around our own neighborhoods all the way up into the forest to give our relatives, plant, human, and animals a fighting chance.
Re-indigenizing our society is not a matter of choice, it's a matter of collective survival. And I'm sure if you made it this far in this video, you are fully on board with shifting the colonial capitalistic paradigm on a systemic level. But if you've made it this far into this video, it is also very likely that you're not a member of the US Congress, the US government, nor are you a billionaire rubber baron. In other words, on an individual level, there's not much that you can do about the system, especially as the concepts of general strike and withdrawal of labour seem to be completely lost to my contemporaries. Don't know why. In the meantime, while I hope that this video can serve as inspiration to organise collectively, my intent here is to give you tools to cope on an individual level because, well, that's what I can have an influence on. Until, hopefully, eventually a more collective approach is organised. So with that being said, how the hell do you indigenize yourself if you weren't born into an indigenous culture? And more importantly, how do you do it without appropriating, without usurping an indigenous identity that isn't yours to claim to begin with? Well, in case I haven't made it obvious yet, if we go by nativist definition of indigeneity, then I am not technically indigenous. So in this conversation, if we look purely at my social status, my position is actually much closer to that of white European settlers than it is to indigenous folks living according to their indigenous practices anywhere in the world. That is why I think I have a responsibility here to approach this conversation as a student of indigenous living rather than as an authority. But, as Paulo Freire would tell you, students can have a lot to teach too, especially as most of my audience, I assume, sits much further away from indigeneity than I do. My own lived experience and expertise tells me that nativism itself is a colonizer concept. And understanding indigeneity as simply belonging to the first group to settle on a given land completely misses the essence of indigeneity, and that's by design. It is in the interest of coloniality, after all, to make you believe that there is no path for you towards an indigenous way of living, that you are trapped in the monolithic world of coloniality, and that there is no alternative to empire. Indeed, it is a fact that there isn't a piece of land on Earth to which some indigenous groups don't already belong. So if you understand indigenous as the first group of people arrived, as coloniality wants you to believe, then yeah, we're screwed. All land on Earth is already taken, and unless you pull in Elizabeth Warren, well soz, but according to nativism, you snooze, you lose. No indigenous identity for you. But my dear, humanity is so much more imaginative than that. There's a multiplicity of ways we can practice living outside of empire and reconnect with indigenous ways of being without committing a nakba at every turn. In fact, any group of people whose claim to the land is premised upon the erasure, elimination, or subjugation of another group of people, or any other living creature on said land for that matter, by definition cannot develop a healthy and nurturing relationship to that land and to the people on it. And that regardless of the order of arrival or of how far back you claim your people existed on that land. Doing that immediately voids any claim to indigeneity. I hope that answers your question, dear online troll. Because indigeneity is not determined by order of arrival. It's a way of practicing relationships with the land, with the other, and with life in general. It's what Lauren Tynan, an indigenous trial World War scholar from Tasmania, describes in her 2021 paper as relationality, which, she explains, is a framework of indigenous knowledges, practices, and responsibilities with kin. It shifts the paradigm from defining our place in society in terms of hierarchy and power structures to defining our identities through how we are related to everybody and to everything around us, in our past, in the present, and in the future. Isn't that more affirming and liberating than being defined by the place where we were born? And the good news that I've come here to bring to you today, my sweet lambs, is that we have examples of non-native people practicing indigenous relationality everywhere around us. So you too can try it at home, only under the supervision of an adult. Starting with my people on my home island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. In Guadeloupe, even more so than other places of the region, the settlement of the Europeans was particularly successful at wiping out the Kalinago, the indigenous people who inhabited the island at the time the European first arrived. So nativism might tell you that Guadeloupe is now a land without indigenous people, but that is not what the past 500 years attests. If you apply the principles of relationality, the land of Guadeloupe has seen the presence of a cultural group whose relationship with land was more symbiotic than exploitative, and whose people saw themselves as stewards of the land rather than owners of it. And those are the then enslaved and now formerly enslaved Afro-descendants, the black people, later joined also by the indentured servants coming from India. In the face of the extractive oppression of chattel slavery and colonization in the Caribbean, developing and sustaining a reciprocal, nurturing relationship with land as a means of both survival and resistance, made those groups de facto indigenous to the Caribbean, even if they came to this land chained to the hold of a ship. By the way, this is why I don't particularly subscribe to any Afro-diasporic movements that yearns for a return to Africa as the one solution to our problems. If we do it right, I think that 500 millennium is enough time to call a place home, I believe. And my people shouldn't have to leave 500 years of identity, history and ancestrality behind to be free. Sadly, like most places in the world, the reality of the Guadeloupean society today is one that has completely embraced empire, capitalism, consumerism, but I know the roots of indigeneity are still there, and my hope is to one day go back and feel them grow again. But now you may ask, what about the places where the indigenous population were not entirely wiped out? Is there a path to indigeneity when the spot is already taken? Well, for a possible answer, let's have a look at what happened in Brazil, where slavery was practiced at such a large scale over such a wide expanse of forested land that some enslaved people who had escaped their plantation, the Maroons, managed to regroup and build autonomous, sustainable communities hidden away in the Brazilian wilderness, the Quilombos. During the times of the Quilombos, the formerly enslaved Maroons had numerous exchanges with the indigenous people they were sharing the land with. They traded with them, they learned from them how to survive in the local environment, and they at times even formed community with them. So what does this show us? This shows us that the story of a newcomer invading a place, fighting for control over territory and resources against those who were there before, is not the inevitable story of humanity, as usually presented to us. We have real-life examples that show us that it's not always like that. So we don't have to reproduce those destructive cycles of invasion. They are not human nature, they are colonizer nature. They're the way of empire. And we can choose to reject that. With her paper on relationality, Lauren Tynan again can help us conceptualize how pre-Columbian indigenous people, enslaved Afro-descendants, and indentured servants in the Americas could coexist on the same land and are actually all related. She proposes the following word game. If you ask the question, how are a river and a mountain similar? The common Western thinking would seek to categorize the two entities into a broader classification and would conclude that they are both part of nature, for instance. Nothing wrong with that, right? But through the lens of indigenous relationality, rather than using a classificatory practice, we can instead look for likeness between the two entities, river and mountain, by identifying a relationship they hold to one another. In that case, we could say, for instance, that the river flows down from the mountain, and that's how they are similar. With this answer, we demonstrated a relational reality in which the river and the mountain are alike due to their relationality, their kinship. And now, if I were to ask you, just for fun, which of the river or the mountain owns the other? Which one is superior to the other? And which one would be justified to control the other? If your first reaction is to think, Joyce, what is wrong with you? These questions make no sense. Well, congratulations. You've already begun to think outside of coloniality and empire. See how natural that feels? And we can play the same word game with social groups in any given country that exist under the rule of empire. How are the formerly enslaved, the indigenous and the exploited laborers similar? Their liberation from coloniality and capitalism flows down from a mutually nurturing relationship with kin, with country, and from unity against their common oppressor. And so, as it turns out, the indigenous notion of relationality combines really well with what some old bearded white dude would call class interests, class solidarity, and class struggle. Isn't it? Speaking of white dudes, now is finally the time some of you viewers have been anxiously waiting for. Yes, dear white people, if you choose to behave, you too can get your indigeneity card. Careful though, I didn't say you can become indigenous. I'm saying that you too can create a relational reality with yourself, with others, and with the land, with country. And for that, let's stay in Brazil and look at the case of the Seringueiros. Between roughly the 1870s and the 1910s, Thanks to several industrial breakthroughs and the advent of the automobile, the world experienced the rubber boom. But until we invented synthetic replacement to rubber, the only way to get rubber was by tapping it from an existing mature rubber tree. You couldn't just make rubber, you could only get what nature was willing to give you in her own time. And where was the only place on earth that naturally grew rubber trees? The Amazonian forest in Brazil. This created a sudden demand for a very specific type of labor in a very specific area. That was the job of the seringueiros, a group of mostly white people whose whiteness turned out to be insufficient to keep them out of poverty in the unforgiving climate of the Brazilian Northeast, and who had to migrate to the Amazonian forest in the hope of being employed as rubber gatherers. The seringueiros were new to the land of Amazonia, where numerous indigenous populations were already established, and they were white. And yet, their subsistence depended on the sustainable management and protection of the forest as it was, in its natural existing equilibrium. And that made them natural allies to the indigenous movement, because they had a shared interest in building a healthy, mutually nurturing relationality with the forest and with those who depended on it. And this is the story of how the Alliance of the People of the Forest was born, led by the charismatic Chico Mendes, a white seringueiro originally from the Brazilian Northeast, who advocated and was eventually assassinated for his fight for the rights and the common interests of the indigenous people of the Amazon forest and the exploited white seringueiros. Those groups may have not belonged to the same ethnic identity, but they shared mutual interests because they belonged to the same class. In fact, one of the most famous quotes attributed to Chico Mendes is that ecology without class warfare is just gardening. Turns out he probably never said that, it's an urban legend. But the point is still valid though. If indigenous is a racialized identity and a social status, indigeneity is a relationship with the self, with the other, and with the collective. It is kinship and responsibility to the land. And it is also a struggle against forces of extraction and disconnection. It's a struggle against empire. And before the class reductionists out there get too excited, yes, we can boil it down to class warfare, but that's only because race inequality within that specific class was somewhat flattened by poverty. But guess what race the employers, the landowners, the factory owners, the lawmakers, and the capitalists all happen to be in this story? Yeah, white, of course. This story of class warfare still happens in the context of white supremacy. Let's not get our facts twisted here. And that's why I would add to the ecology without class warfare is gardening metaphor that ecology without critical race theory is a white picket fence lawn. So we don't need to be born indigenous to re-indigenize ourselves. We don't need to claim an indigenous identity to re-indigenize ourselves, and we don't need to pack our stuff and go live in the forest to re-indigenize ourselves. Of course, for our individual re-indigenization to be complete, it will still require systemic change, a collective uprising, and a revolution. But if we understand that coloniality and empire are everywhere, in every society, then so too can indigeneity re-emerge anywhere as a response to it. We can let go of the hierarchical structures of empire. We can challenge the disconnections, the compartmentalization, the separations and the alienations that coloniality thrives on. We can leave behind the promises of the monoculture of capitalism. We can seek out ways of being and knowing that exist outside of the norm. We can begin to shift the paradigm with ourselves and each other right here and right now. To imagine a multiplicity of new futures, we need to reconnect with the indigenous present and with the multiple pasts that once were. The seeds are already here. We just need to learn to spot them, to water them, and to cherish them until they grow into a new society. They will show us our new futures. But for that, we also need to let go of a certain colonized way of perceiving change and of perceiving time passing by. Living through societal change is scary, because all you need is a minimum of empathy to see that people are suffering. And that's precisely why the quicker we learn to let go of things that no longer serve us, the better off we will be. Empire is constantly trying to make us its flying monkeys, relying on us to knowingly or unknowingly do its bidding and uphold its structures. It does that by convincing us that no matter how ugly society is, there's no better option. It is much easier to keep a prisoner locked up if they've been convinced that the outside was full of hungry monsters desperate to eat them alive. The prisoner will never try to escape, and they will even fight their inmates trying to get out, believing that they're saving them. And so there's a bit of that prisoner in all of us. We all have a lot of internalized colonial and imperial biases to deconstruct. As all living creatures, it's absolutely normal for us to aspire to a certain degree of stability and continuity that we think we will get by keeping things as they are. But nothing in nature says that for something to be durable, it necessarily means that it must not change. It turns out that it's really hard to let go when everything in our culture is telling us that change can only be the result of a catastrophic event, implying that anything that changes has failed, that what doesn't last forever is somehow inherently flawed, that anything that isn't fixed and immutable is weak, that everything which changes is unreliable. All of those beliefs and moral values that we assign to change are purely cultural and not at all natural. They are the result of a belief system designed to keep us prisoners. Jenny Núñez, in her book Descolonizando Afetos, Decolonizing Affections in English, explains how our colonial monoculture has come to associate change with deception, betrayal, and lie. She traces it back to ancient Greece, with Plato, who described time as the moving image of eternity, which would suggest, she says, that according to Plato, time is a corrupted imitation of eternity, a fake. And that's the same logic that would be later adopted by Christianity, and which in turn would become the culture of the 15th century European colonizers. By that logic, all that is perfect is fixed, eternal, and immutable. Three criteria that completely exclude nature itself. Nature is the opposite of fixed, eternal, and immutable. Nature couldn't care less about what has become our cultural and moral aversion to change. Nature is cyclical. Nature evolves. Nature moves on. Nature is all about change. And so indigenous cultures, which are in tune with nature and embrace cyclicality, they accept and celebrate the fact that change is part of life. I'm convinced that reconnecting with indigenous temporality to understand the moment we're living can help us through this. In the words of Jenny Núñez, that I'll translate from Portuguese,
perfume é menos cheiroso porque seu aroma não dura
does a perfume
eternamente?
smell less good because its smell doesn't
Uma
last
música é
forever?
menos bonita porque dura apenas
Is a
alguns
song
minutos?
less nice because it only lasts a few minutes?
O sabor de alimento
Is
é menos
food less
gostoso
tasty
porque
because
acaba?
it runs out?
O pôr do sol é menos deslumbrante
Is the
porque dá lugar à
sunset
noite?
less breathtaking because it gives rise to the night? Meanwhile, Empire, which in case you hadn't gathered, couldn't care less about nature, because it does in fact exist entirely in defiance of nature, Empire as a project tries to overcome cyclicality, to remove itself from time altogether. Think about it. The only acceptable period of time for Empire is eternity. Empire can only last forever, and everything that Empire does, all of its rules and actions, starts from this erroneous principle. This is a negation of history and life. Empire cannot conceive itself as changing or ending. And we, as the product of this monoculture that worships eternity and demonizes change, logically have become terrified by the notions of change, of evolution, and even death. As Jenny Núñez also remarks with sarcasm, a leaf that was once green and has turned brown hasn't failed. And it's interesting to notice that as Empire tries to soar above time, to remove itself from temporality, at the same time, it tries to stop the time for indigenous and colonized people. It tries to lock them in the past and try to convince us that this is where they belong. Basically, Empire has always wanted us to believe that indigeneity was dead. But that's only a reflection of its own fear of death. Indigeneity is still here. changing, evolving, and it will remain connected to life long after empire has fallen. Throughout the ages and the continents, death was always considered part of life. But our global monoculture tries to make it a taboo, a form of failure. And as a result, because we are not socialized to process death collectively, in community, we are terrified by it. We try to trick death, but by repressing it, we become obsessed by it. What culture do you think is the most anxious about death? The culture that accepts, celebrates, and sacralizes it? Or the cultures that try to escape it by making it shameful and taboo? Once we begin to accept change and death as part of life, part of ourselves, and part of our society, we can begin to be less anxious about it and get excited about change as opposed to being terrified by it like empire is. The forest outside of the walls of our prison keeps changing, and the jailer wants us to be afraid of that. Colonial temporality and the worship of forever are cultural constructs designed to put fear in our minds and trick us into resisting change at all costs, and into fighting to maintain the status quo even as empire is killing us. Empire wants us to internalize the possibility of its ending as literally the worst catastrophe that can happen in the entire universe. We have been brainwashed into perceiving the protection of empire as a higher priority than our own survival and the survival of our species. We put more effort into the maintenance of the walls of our jail, and for free, than we put into trying to bring those walls down. That means that emancipation from empire has to begin with accepting that it will end. Once we've come to terms with that indisputable fact, we can open our eyes to the reality that it is already ending, currently as we speak. And once we're at peace with the fact that the walls are crumbling down, we can begin to organize to get out before the roof collapses on us. We can finally start imagining how beautiful life could be after empire, outside of the jail. To imagine new futures, to fully escape from empire, we need to reconnect with the present and with the multiple pasts that once were. And so indigenous temporality can help us do that by helping us getting comfortable with the idea of things having an end. Since it's the colonizer's mindset to perceive anything that doesn't last as a failure, let's bring back cyclicality into our lives and allow ourselves to have an evolving society. After all, that's literally the meaning of revolution. It's the completion of a cycle. It's the continuation of the natural state of things, which is to move, to change, to evolve. Our language is tricking us here, because by calling it the fall of empire, there's the implication of something negative. But it doesn't have to be, or at least not for everybody. It is clear to me that the Western-centric colonial imperialist interpretation of history is biased towards an idealization of all empires that have existed, and that we have been conditioned to perceive the fall of an empire as a much more cataclysmic and singular event that it actually feels like when it inevitably does happen.
Look at the diversity of artistic expression that just exploded after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Since apparently white men think about the Roman Empire every day, I asked my friend Elio, aka Jupiter Baal, who is an expert in classical antiquity, if the fall of the Roman Empire was really as dark as we assume it to have been, and if that history could teach us anything positive about what we're going through right now. Is there any way that actually, for someone who was living through that period that we consider as the fall of empire, that things would have actually gotten better for them?
It was positive because, like to be able to have a steady supply of slaves, you'd have to go and raid villages. You have a whole system of people who all of a sudden stopped being affected by slave catchers.
Mm.
There were the people who lived in the Roman Empire who were able to, for instance, they potentially might have escaped slavery and so on and so forth. But look at Rome as the center of a network and think about it in terms of all of the people that it oppressed and that it stopped having the power to oppress and that were able to live their lives. And even if you look at it, if you look at the fall of the Roman Empire and people, and again, beef with this fascination with neoclassical architecture, it stifled growth and innovation of people's self-expression when it came to art. Look at the difference when it comes to painting, when it comes to the type of clothing that people wore, the type of music that is, the explosion of languages that came out of the end of the Roman Empire that allowed us to have literature and poetry and prose that potentially would have never happened.
So the good news is, unless you're an oligarch, the fall of empire is likely to make things better for you and benefit all of us. Eventually. Now, if you go watch the full 47-minute conversation on either my Patreon or Jupiter Bard's Patreon, you will see that he was very cautious to not romanticize the fall of the Roman Empire, in the same way as I'm being very cautious to not minimize the human suffering that is currently being caused by the collapse of our society. But again, if we remember that history is written by the victors, the ruling class, the jailers' bosses, and if we keep in mind that their life of opulence had nothing to do with the material reality of the 99% of the exploited majority of us, the population, who lived through those times, why should we believe the elite's perspective on the fall of empire? They're not a reliable source.
The majority of sources that we have were of the very limited number of people who are educated and who were, like some of them were absolutely appalled when you see the literature from the late period of the Roman Empire. They're absolutely appalled by the fall of the Roman Empire because, they were benefiting from the structures of power that they had.
We do not have to internalize the fears of our ruling class because we have no reasons to fear what they fear. And they are counting on you to fear for their interests so that you do their bidding and maintain the status quo. They do not want you to realize that after the chaos and the suffering, when the dust settles, we the people stand to benefit from the fall of empire, like the fall of other empires have benefited people in the past.
I wouldn't say that people were happier. But what I could say conversely was that not having a gigantic hegemonic power that has the power to crush you with their armies, potentially not a bad thing. If you are at the edge of the Roman Empire, or if you are a part of one of the populations that were consistently predated by the Roman Empire, you might have a situation that is not stable in the future because you don't have a centralized stabilizing force. But on the other hand, you don't have a gigantic centralized hegemonic force that erupts into chaos every time that a new guy takes the wheel. And if the new guy takes the wheel is insane, you have to deal with it from, Lisbon to Alexandria.
For those of us privileged who still manage to get our individual and collective needs met for now, and I include myself in this, I think our job is to make sure that if the structures and hierarchies of society are going to collapse, and the collapse has begun already, we make them collapse on those whose greed and selfishness is responsible for this mess. The billionaires, the broligarchs and their goons, the corporations that have grown more powerful than entire nations. Since chaos is already enveloping the world through no fault of our own, we might as well seize the opportunity to liberate ourselves, to fight so that a better society rises from the ashes of this fire that we didn't start. Have you noticed how European and white Western politicians alike love to muse about the positives of colonization, sparking the same tired debate at least once a year, acting as if they had just stumbled across a brand new white supremacist talking point that we'd never heard before, just like Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered America? Well, I say that it's about time we threw the insult back in the face of those colonizers. And without falling into accelerationism, on behalf of all of the colonized people, the exploited, the oppressed, I think there's no harm in musing over the positives of the fall of this little empire of theirs that they got going there. And so to conclude and to bring us back to the topic of my video essay, which is divesting from empire, I want to leave the viewer with something positive and maybe a different way of looking at what is undeniably the fall of something. If we pick different criteria, we may see it as evolution and progress in certain ways.
I think we need to evaluate what we consider happiness and what we consider sustainability and try to separate it from progress and try to separate it from what we consider to be our identity as Westerners,
right,
and our privilege and comfort. Because we are starting to understand our place in the world by learning who we are and by learning how we consume what we consume. because all of this luxury that we benefited is fake. This is being based on the exploitation and the burning of the whole world. It will allow us also to be more inventive, like people were during the medieval period after the fall of the Roman Empire, with less resources that we don't exploit or extract in a negative way from other people. It will allow us to connect with people, not on the basis of our patronizing ideas of what the world should be, but in a true open dialogue, for us to be able to understand from them what they can teach us. Just an example, we're going through a gigantic climate change event. If I am less arrogant, I can go to countries in Central Africa that we have always made fun institutionally because they had mud huts, and understand the type of architecture that they use there that allowed them to be able to withstand heat and use materials that we have freely available. That we have freely available, that are sustainable.
And that's advanced technology that they've had for centuries. Yeah. My thesis is that actually we can bring those two things together if we start to re-indigenize ourselves. Make it easier for us to let go of our privileges that are built on the exploitation and extraction of resources and other people. But as a swap, we replace that by greater connection, deeper connection with other people, with the world, with the land, with ancestrality.
There's everything to gain from this because, again, the world is on fire. And the world is on fire because we consume too much. We burn through too many things to maintain a growth aspiration that is absolutely unsustainable, because things don't just continue to grow. That's why I say that we have misplaced notions of happiness, because what you said, living happily within the things that we can sustainably do, shouldn't be a sacrifice. It should be, because the recompense that we're going to get from it in the end is that we're going to live in a better world that is more sustainable and that is more equitable.
So maybe then it would help to reframe the moment we live in. Is this a societal collapse, or are we breaking free from a monolithic future? Is this the fall of an empire, or is humanity beginning to outgrow empire? As painful as it is, maybe we're just molting. Maybe it's time to shed our own colonial shell. Let's give ourselves permission to rejoice in the end of empire. That's okay, we've earned it. It's okay to let go. It's okay to let go. Instead of looking with doom and dread at the history of humanity as a succession of failing and then falling empires, what if we celebrated the ability for people and civilizations to come up with something new every time? The inventiveness to start afresh, the courage to walk away from the systems and structures that were no longer working for them. I'll leave you with a call to action. Look around you and ask yourself, who embodies the greatest challenge to empire in your circles? What community, what culture seems to live and even thrive at the periphery of an exploitative system? What can you learn from them? How can you engage with their knowledge, their ways of being, their cosmology, without appropriating or extracting from them? In this war of the narratives, how can you defect from the Western colonized camp of narratives and join forces with narratives from outside the realm of empire? Have you done the work of exploring what interests and goals you may share with them, and how you can connect with their struggles without being a distraction or an extra burden for them? Can you ask them what they need from you? And can you be honest about how you may be able to contribute in the fight for your common goals? Have you challenged hierarchies today? Have you practiced connectedness? Have you put your feet on the ground barefoot? What are your privileges, and have you used them for good today? The seeds of a new society are already here, scattered across the world. We just need to water them, to relearn the practices that help them grow, and they will show us our new futures. Rather than passively let the world end on us, we are ending our relationship with this world as we know it. We have an opportunity to get the tables to turn again. Divesting from empire is more than making believe that empire simply doesn't exist. It's understanding and practicing relationality with empire so we can reclaim agency over how it connects with us and how we eventually disconnect from it. Empire isn't only power exerted over us, empire is part of us. We are part of it, and as such we can change our relation to it, therefore we can change it. The more we learn to recognize internalized empire within us, the deeper we can reach to root it out of our beings. The better we understand our place within empire, the easier it gets to imagine ourselves outside of it. The more clearly we can picture the lush forests of futures awaiting beyond the boundaries of empire, the smoother we'll find our journey towards the end of empire. So yes, the world is ending yet again. But in that yet again, rather than being the harbinger of an inescapable fate that we are doomed to reproduce over and over again, I actually see a sign of hope. It reminds us that people have been through this before, and they survived. They're out here existing, fighting, thriving, and they can show us the way through this. We're in this with them. And that's it. Whew. Well, this has been different. That was a lot. A lot. It's been very different from anything I've ever done before. I think I can safely say that this was the biggest project I've ever undertaken in my life. And I'm so relieved that I can change outfit and get this washed because it was starting to smell funky. In the process of writing this video essay, things started to fall into place in my head, and at the same time as I was creating it, it was sort of guiding me. What had started as a simple commentary video turned into a battle cry, and then eventually it morphed into a whole ass manifesto, and now it's the prequel to the book I'm working on. But I feel so relieved I did it, because it's giving a structure and a sense of direction to what used to be a loose set of disconnected thoughts and words views that I had. Now it's all in here. Any content that I make in the future, I can always refer back to this. This is me. This is where I'm at in my life and in the world right now. And I'm proud of it. I hope that watching this has been as cathartic and perhaps therapeutic for you as it has been for me writing it. So, although producing this video essay has meant that I've had to stop making content for 3 months, stopped replying to emails, to DMs, stopped replying to my friends, stopped accepting gigs, my hope is that once this is out of the way, it'll inspire me to make even more content than before. But for that, I need to first recoup the costs and energy that I've just spent in this, because right now, I don't have the means to make another one. All of my savings went into making this video, and I'm not yet monetizing my content, so hopefully this will change now. Fingers crossed. So in the words of Bernie Sanders, I am once again asking for your support. Liking, commenting, subscribing to this channel, subscribing to my Patreon. But also, aside from money, I am without a manager. I don't have a producer, I don't have an assistant. I do have a literary agent though. Hannah has been fantastic and massively supportive. But outside of that, I'm wearing more hats than my neurodivergent brain has the capacity for. So if you have any of those type of skills and are in contact with people who do, and who you know would be interested in working with me, send them my way. Now I'll probably spend the next few weeks catching up with all the emails and inquiries that have been piling up since November. I hope I didn't get too many people upset by not replying to them. I wasn't ignoring you, I'm just a neurodivergent dude with monotropism. I can only focus on one thing at a time. Yes, sometimes that means 4 months of that one thing. Alright then, I assume the acknowledgements and credits have finished rolling now, so all I have left to do now is thank Camille, my video editor, for putting up with my pivots and my Delulu timelines, and Erdem, my community manager and graphic designer. Well, this wouldn't have been possible without you. Hopefully I'll see you soon in these streets, and don't forget to divest from empire any way you can.